Black people, we've got to fight. Jean Petro, you see us. Oguo, we've got to fight. Let's go fight. Oh, Black people, we've got to fight. Zumbi, you see us. Oguo, we've got to fight. Let's go fight. Oh, Black people, we've got to fight. Yes, Santewa, you see us. Oguo, we've got to fight. Let's go fight. Oh, Black people, we've got to fight. Bookman, you see us. Oh, we've got to fight. Let's go fight. Oh,
we have to have the courage to construct our own reality. And that's what Garvey was talking about. Because he said he looked around, he didn't see what he thought should be there, and so what did he do? He didn't get depressed about it. He didn't get defeated about it. He said, I'm going to build the government that we need to have. Ooh, where do you get that kind of boldness from? So we got to go all the way back to Garvey, who said he would come again. He said he would be here with us, no matter how long it took. And I'm telling you that the way he comes back is in our work. Not honoring him in words, pomp, and all of that stuff, but honoring him through doing what he did. How many of us have the courage to do that? The man took on the world for us and in our name. And then we come to Sodai. And in this presentation of the paradigm, I'm going to make this like what it is we want to reach. So Sodai is translated clear word in Dogana language. And I use it to mean that here we gain understanding. This is sight with understanding. And it is seeing beyond what just we think we see with this physical thing. It's seeing beyond that. And so we gain vision, because that's what vision is. With vision, you've got to be able to use the imagination informed by the African spirit. And Brother Amos, who I work very closely with, was a good friend of mine. He taught me, and he would talk about imagination. Image a nation. Do you see? But that's got to be part of vision. To be a visionary, you got to see beyond this box here. You got to see beyond the ma'afa. You got to see what is it that our people rightfully should have, and that's what Garvey did. Garvey had a vision.
The real reason for all of this hostility is because some perceive that what is happening in Grenada can lead to a new socio-economic and political path of development. They give all kinds of reasons and excuses, some of them credible, some utter rubbish. There's an interesting one that we saw very recently in a secret report of the State Department. I want to tell you about that one, so you can reflect on that one. That secret report made this point, that Grenada is different to Cuba and Nicaragua. And the Grenada Revolution is in one sense even worse, I'm using their language, than the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions, because the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada speaks English and therefore can communicate directly to the people of the United States. I can see from your applause, sisters and brothers, that you agree with the report. But I want to tell you what that same report also said, and said that also made us very dangerous. And that is that the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada are predominantly black. They said that 95% of our population is black, and they had a correct statistic. And if we have 95% of predominantly African origin in our country, then we can have a dangerous appeal to 30 million black people in the United States. Now, that aspect of the report clearly is one of the most sensible ones.
Tena Mwari, be thankful unto the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe. Kudzai Mudzimu Mukulu. We give praises unto the great ancestors, because our ancestors are worthy to be praised. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodi, African power and African liberation for all African people. Greetings and welcome, brothers and sisters, to this edition of our sessions with Elder Cecil Gutsmore. We are glad you are with us and give thanks for your presence here. Apologies for a slightly later start than scheduled. Our Solitinga, brothers and sisters, but we're there and we're going to get into the thing. I want to let you know, brothers and sisters, before I bring forward Elder Cecil, let's give you a few notifications about things that you need to know about that are coming up and that you can access right now, brothers and sisters. And so the first and foremost, I want to let you know about the African World, the War Report, special edition, the War Report, brothers and sisters. Yes, indeed, as published by Mama Marimba, Annie, and a team, including myself. We have published this war report in relation to many of the uprisings and protests and shifts in political atmosphere that are taking place on the African continent and throughout the African world. And we have published detailed reports, investigations, and analysis on all of the above, brothers and sisters. And so as it says, you'll find analysis in here on everything from Kenya to Haiti. Yes, indeed, brothers and sisters, and more. Yeah, and so Mana said it's because me they contribute to it, But it is an excellent publication, brothers and sisters. Very, very timely, and all of the feedback that I have received from it suggests and gives testimony to its value. And so, as you can see here, it includes contributions from Mama Marimba Ani, Brother Sheyon Kuti, Sheon Anikolapa Kuti, son of Fela Anikolapa Kuti, Baba Ngugi Wationgo, Jafrik Aiti, who you will have seen on Kimbunga Media previously, and you will see him again soon, brothers and sisters, and many, many more, including myself and others. Yeah, so you do want to get your hands on this publication, and you can do so right now, absolutely free, by clicking the link in the description to the video. Clicking the link in the description to the video, or visit kimbungamedia.com, and it will take you to the relevant place that you need to go to get the publication. But the link is directly in the video to this description, brothers and sisters. Also, I want to let you know that our first, reschedule, reform, relaunch of the Kushkim University is coming at the end of this month. Yeah, and so for those who are on a Patreon, who are part of our Patreon family, you will have access to watch this as of next week. Yeah, as of next week, you will have access to watch the presentation from the People's Professor, the Black History Man himself, Robin Walker, on the ancient empire of Ghana. Yeah, and the October edition is already on deck, so do stay tuned for that. And we're going to be having, sessions on African-centered education, the crisis in the Congo, many, many things, brothers and sisters, are going to be coming to you monthly via Kushkim University. So do stay tuned, but stay tuned for more information. I just wanted to let the Patreons know, all those on our Patreon, you will have access to watch this as of next week. Yeah, next week should be Monday next week, Monday next week, but do stay tuned for more information. All right, that's it as far as the announcements are concerned. Actually, I should let you know that if you're paying attention, look in the description to the video, and our good brother Robin Walker is the face of a institution, an educational institution, the Black Studies, an online Black Studies institution called the Black Secret, and we are currently proudly affiliates of the Black Secret. And so if you would like to do a three stage Black Studies course, a course that I have done, and trust me, it is excellent in terms of what it offers, in terms of knowledge, information, and also strategies for personal development and even financial development, brothers and sisters. There's a link in the description for that as well, and you can also get a discount on your membership to the blacksecret.com. But more on that in the future. But we are growing and developing and strengthening our connections with other African-centered, Pan-African institutions in the global African community. I want to say, give thanks for all those who have been sending their feedback and their love on the session that we did last week with Elder Cecil and Auntie Claire Holder, Dr. Claire Holder, on Carnival, getting some excellent feedback about that. And do stay tuned, because there's going to be much more to say on that. If you're listening carefully, there were many statements that were made that require further work and follow up, and so we're going to definitely be doing that on Kimbunga Media from now on. So stay tuned for that. We're not come off of that issue there. And also the feedback on the analysis that we gave on Kemi Badenoch, conservative leadership hopeful Kemi Badenoch, who has been running around claiming that she grew up under a socialist military government in Nigeria, with as a means of painting the conservative government in the UK of the 1980s and 90s as a model government, I'm saying, for one to live under. And so we have done some analysis on that, and people have been giving their feedback, so we appreciate you, and we want to say to you that we are going to be doing more of the short form videos, so do stay tuned for more of that, because obviously people love that. So we want to appreciate you for taking the time to share your feedback. Plenty of things are going on, plenty of things are going in the world, brothers and sisters. I was scheduled to do a session on the Grenfell report, on Ojibwe Tuesday gone. And I wasn't able to do that, but I will be doing that next week. So do stay tuned, because that Grenfell report is extremely important in terms of its findings and in terms of the implications of its findings. So do stay tuned for that. And obviously, for those who have been paying attention to what's going on across the Atlantic as far as America is concerned, you would have watched that debate. And the Trumpists, them vex, them are run wrong on a ball, I'm saying, because people say them him did lose the debate, and the Kamala supporters are running around acting like Kamala Harris is the second coming of Jesus Christ, or maybe Barack Obama. Neither of those possibilities am I celebrating, brothers and sisters, but I'm just highlighting those things to say that these are things that are going on in the world and subjects that we'll be coming back to on Kimbunga Media in the coming weeks. But today, brothers and sisters, today, and I know for some reason this topic seems to have excited, many people, and so we don't want to delay the proceedings any further. But our topic is RODNEY versus Kwame Nkrumah, a critical analysis. And that title may confuse enough people because one may be given to the idea, and possibly, when it comes to debates among great leaders and movements, and especially within the Pan-African realm, the only debates that you hear like that are usually between Marxists and socialists and nationalists. That's about it. Very few people would actually consider that there may have been some differences, say, between a Kwame Nkrumah and a Walter Rodney, because they might be seen to be on the same side of the tradition, so to speak, which is true, However, there were some critiques that, our Baba Walter Rodney levied that in relation to the assumption for Kwame Nkrumah that requires more analysis. And so we are going to bring forward Elder Cecil because there are few more able to delve into and dissect these permutations, than our Elder Cecil Gutsmore. So let us bring him on now and say greetings and welcome, Elder Cecil.
Greetings to you, my brother, and to our listeners and viewers. It is good to be with you. Let me say at once, I'm not feeling 100%, but I hope to get through the event anyway. And since you were announcing upcoming events, may I humbly draw people's attention, especially if they're living in London, to an event at Croydon Supplementary Education Project. It's in Sydenham Road, Croydon, this Saturday at 7 p.m., where I will be speaking, believe it or not, on the Pan-African heritage of play, sport, and games. When people see that topic, they might think, boy, what's Gutsmore doing forcing us down the sports route? And so it's the extent to which sport, play, and game is a big and positive part of our heritage that I'm going to be exploring. And Robin told me today that under 7 people have signed up. I'm going to talk anyway, and Robin will host anyway. But some people who view here or listen here might wish to come along and criticize what I have to say or listen to it positively anyway. So,
all right.
So 7 o'clock, Croydon Supplementary Project, 32 to 34 Sydenham Road, Croydon, CRO 2EF.
Okay, Saturday, that would be the 14th,
yes, it's the 14th, yes.
Yes. All right. So do stay. Check that out. And having been a student of Robin Walker on that particular issue, there's much that we often don't give our consideration in terms of sports.
Yes, indeed. Robin was the researcher on a film on sport in Kemet, which is something, believe it or not, that I initiated, and that got. This is not the forum for that, but that got stolen from me by the person who commissioned Robin.
Interested.
But there we are. So on Saturday, if people don't have anything better to do, please come along and participate in that.
All right.
Okay. Yes.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna hand over to you. Before I do so, let me just let people know that I will be taking starring your questions. Yeah. So if you have a question at any point that you want to ask Elder Cecil, or you want me to note it for later on, please at Kimbunga Media with your comment, yeah, in the chat, and we will come to it. Yeah. And as always, if there is time and space, then we will share the link at the end of Elder Cecil's remarks, and we'll come back to you. For now, over to you, Elder Cecil.
Before you go, my brother, I want to say in your presence that I'm in fact not as prepared as you would like me to be, and as I promised to be, on this dispute, if it is, between Walter and Nkrumah.
Yes.
I've been a little bit busy in the last 2 weeks, and I actually haven't caught up on that. So
Right.
what I want to do, I'm grateful to you for having some years ago recorded very well and put up online me speaking about Kwame Nkrumah. And anybody, you no doubt remember that event somewhere in South London again on one wonderful Saturday, where some Ghanaians put on this event, and I spoke on Nkrumah, and you were there recording it, and you put it up. So I'm actually reasonably proud of that little discourse of mine, and what it shows is that I'm a great admirer of this wonderfully significant figure, Kwame Nkrumah, and any dispute, even though I'm not necessarily dealing with it tonight, although if you raise points, I'm perfectly willing to answer them, or even if the listeners, having been told that I'm talking about this, raise points, I'm perfectly happy to try to answer them. But I don't believe that in late 20th century Pan-Africanism or 21st century Pan-Africanism, any dispute between Walter and Nkrumah is at the center of what we have to be dealing with, not because such disputes are unimportant, but because of what they both represent. Both represent extraordinary minds who engaged both practically and theoretically with our situation, and generated understandings of our situation which are fundamental to understand and try to use. Now, they operated in substantially different circumstances in a way. Everybody knows that Kwame Nkrumah was in the States in the 20s and 30s, was very influenced by Marcus Garvey, and was also influenced by, he says, Marx and Engels, and returned to Africa via the United Kingdom in the 5th, and made his important mark in the 5th Pan-African Congress held in Manchester in 1945. Now, that event and what came out of it defined the Nkrumah moment in a very clear way. It's the moment of the anti-colonial revolution, successfully prosecuted at a certain level, because the outcome is visible in a multiplicity of states in the Caribbean and in Africa and elsewhere in global Africa that are the direct outcome of the rejection by Africans and others of colonialism, and our willingness to challenge colonialism both theoretically and practically, and also militarily. Now, it's interesting, and I may have dealt with this in a way in earlier sessions, but it's easy to think that the big distinction within the revolutionary Pan-Africanist moment, post-1945, if you will, is whether people fought physically, militarily for our freedom, or had it, as it were, handed to us. Now, the extent to which it was handed to us matters, because everybody knows that even though we didn't talk a lot about soul force, the colonialists were satisfied that they couldn't hold on to Africa and the other colonies in the way that they had previously. And to an important extent, what they decided was that they would let go of the colonies, dividing them into two, dividing them between those that were so important to them that they would try to hold on to them via settler colonialism and what went with that. So Kenya, Algeria, almost all of Southern Africa, and so on, to hold on to them. Now, where the confusion arises is that whether, as in Ghana or Jamaica, our leaders, post-colonial leaders, or came to power, whether they came to power via military means or peacefully, the outcome has been the same. And what the great Kwame Nkrumah managed to do was unintentionally to create a new colony in Ghana, given that the forces against it which he was operating were actually more successful than him. And he then went on to understand almost first, and certainly very fully, what the situation that his country had ended up in, particularly after his overthrow, that it represented not a post-colonial independent moment, but the essential implementation of neocolonialism. And Nkrumah, who has a vast range of work, is amongst the first people to theorize the reality of neocolonialism. So, as an anti-colonial leader of an anti-colonial radical African state, Nkrumah was overthrown, and then found the time and political intellectual ability and drive to produce this crucial critique of how things really were in the new dispensation, where white power had apparently left, but hadn't in fact gone anywhere. And that state of affairs, if we look carefully at our world, is first comes into being with Haiti. Haiti, from being the grandest of revolutions, was converted into a neocolony via organizing internal forces to extract money from the people at the bottom to compensate the slave owners for their loss of real property and their human property, so-called, their estates and they're enslaved. So it's not that the state of affairs that Nkrumah and later Rodney and Cabral and Fanon describe and analyze and such, it's not that it's new. It absolutely was not new. As I say, we can argue on serious evidence that Haiti was the first neocolony. But in terms of continental Africa, the next one and the first one on continental Africa is Liberia. And if we look elsewhere at South America, all of those South American countries, formerly Portuguese and Spanish colonies, ended up liberating themselves both from enslavement, big part of their populations were enslaved, and from Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. But the fate of the people at the bottom of the society and the objective relationship between those states and the white power world is that the process of liberation effectively coincided with the imposition of a new order of relationship, which has to be called neocolonial in exactly the way and preceding what Nkrumah first describes so brilliantly in neocolonialism the highest stage of imperialism. So Nkrumah obtained state power, lost it, and is an important figure because of the quality of both his theory and his practice. And even though he ended up losing power and therefore can be said to have been a political failure, in point of fact, his body of work and the total commitment to anti-imperialism, to anti-capitalism, to the need, making the argument that us Africans have to recognize that the enemy took the form not primarily of colonialism, which looked outrageous because the colonialists were white and we were black, or at least not white, and so colonialism looked awful. But what the colonialists contrived effectively to do was immediately to substitute for colonialism an order in which things ran in broadly the same way, excepting that people who didn't look like them were on their behalf. Now, Walter, by contrast, and I'm going to spend some time just reminding people how brilliantly productive, theoretically, our brother Walter Rodney was. Born in 1942 in Guyana, murdered, assassinated, if you will, in Guyana, country of his birth, in 1980. Lived for 38 short years. But if you look at his body of work, his productivity is really extraordinary, and the quality of his mind and research and writing ability is only understood when we realize that Walter theoretically and archivally and mastered the whole of the history of the African continent in extraordinary detail in place after place, understood also the Caribbean and engaged politically in one African country, Tanzania, but also engaged politically in Jamaica. That was before Tanzania. And then later on, in the final 6 years of his life, in the country of his birth, where he felt politically obliged to return to. Now, there are critiques of Walter's failure to take power, and that is something that we have a duty to look at and try to understand. And so it's one of the things that I'm going to be attending to. So what I'm really talking about is not primarily, but only secondarily, if at all, and the extent to which I do it will be a function of what kind of questions get posed to me in the chat or from our brilliant young brother. Walter Rodney was a revolutionary Pan-Africanist born in Guyana to the Guyanese working class, urban working class. His father was a tailor. They came from close to the lowest strata of, but not quite, of Guyanese society. And it was clear immediately that this was a brilliant boy. So he won scholarships all along the road, scholarship out of the ghetto, scholarship into the best school in Guyana. And all of those colonies, by the end, and in fact, very early in the period after the end of enslavement, had good schools. The colonialists were interested everywhere in educating some of the oppressed. And so if you look at the history of the Caribbean and of continental Africa, but since we're talking about Rodney primarily, if you look at that, you will see that in the immediate aftermath of the end of enslavement, that the British actually put money through religious organizations into providing education for some of the ex-enslaved in the Caribbean, because they were satisfied that they needed some people educated in their terms to help them run things. And in that context, schools of the most excellent kind arose in our part of the world. Pre-university level usually, but sometimes actually university level. And because we were bright people, our history shows that from the desperate conditions that we emerged of enslavement and immediate post-slavery, post-enslavement society in the Caribbean, some remarkable people emerged to come to university in France, in the UK, or even in the US, and to achieve extraordinary intellectual and political outcomes as a result of their move. So that is the context in which Walter Rodney emerged. And by the time he emerged, there were territorial, we call them island scholarships if you're in the island part of the Caribbean, but they're really territorial scholarships, 1 or 2 per annum. And obviously immensely competitive. The middle classes, including the teachers, tried to make sure that their children won the scholarship. They didn't always. But in the case of Walter Rodney, here was a tailor's son who distinguished himself, as I said, from very early, won a scholarship to the best college in Guyana, and then a scholarship to the University of the West Indies, where he took a first-class honors degree in history and had and participated in political activity while a student. In fact, he stood for office twice, oddly enough, in the guild of undergraduates, and failed on both occasions because not only might the authorities, including authorities outside of the university, have recognized that his ideas were not quite what they wanted to promote, but more importantly, perhaps in terms of why he didn't get through, in the University of the West Indies then, and to some extent now, the students' unions are a hotbed of preparatory politics for people who are subsequently going to participate in neocolonial politics. And if you're not tied in with one political tendency within that competitive framework of getting a degree, creeping into the political system at the lower level, if you're bright, they notice you quickly, and you end up in the legislatures and frequently as prime minister. Almost all Caribbean territories had a prime minister, maybe more than one, who was a graduate of the University of the West Indies, that Mona campus, before the operation spread to Trinidad and to Barbados. So that's Walter Rodney. He went, as I say, to Mona and got a first, and he was clear that what he wanted to do was to do continental African history. He applied, therefore, to SOAS, got in easily, only to find that the authorities there were questioning his degree. What they didn't understand was that his degree had come from a college of the same university that they were part of, because back in the day, before the University of West Indies became independent, it was actually a college of the University of London. So it's semi-idiotic for the School of Oriental and African Studies, a sub-body of the London University overall university structure, several of them there, actually questioning somebody being produced and one of the best products of their own educational entity, which had parts overseas, university colleges all over the Commonwealth, so-called. So Walter was able to show the SOAS people off. He finished his PhD in extraordinarily good time, probably by about 1967. It was so good that it was immediately picked up by either Oxford or Cambridge University and published, apparently largely unmodified, Oxford University Press, 1970. So published almost unmodified as a book. Walter by then had another book. That other book was called The Groundings with My Brothers. And that had come into being in this way. Walter, as I say, went to SOAS, but had been involved in politics before. And so when, after graduating from SOAS, he returned first to continental Africa for a year, and then to the University of the West Indies, again for a year, for very, very different reasons. He was incredibly well qualified to teach African history, which he was determined to do. There were brilliant fellow students coming out of the same intellectual academic process as him, but he was the sole one who'd obtained a PhD on a major aspect of continental African history, in fact, on the slave trade, because what he'd chosen to study, Walter believed that the system of Atlantic enslavement, one of the most monstrous events in the whole of human history, that even though Africans, few Africans participated actively in enabling it to happen, that it could not have happened other than in circumstances in which Europe, moving into capitalism and with the resources that came from the stealing of resources from the bottom of the society, concentrating those resources into guilds and into royalty and into the top of the emerging bourgeoisie, that they have the money to invest in what became the Atlantic slave trade. Walter actually explored it in a way before those forces become all that relevant, because he focuses in the first instance on the Portuguese involvement in transatlantic African enslavement. And it actually starts before anybody comes across the Atlantic inside of that process. It starts the moment the Portuguese get down the western coast of Africa, and effectively they are enabled to do that by the capture of a North African city, Ceuta, I think it's called, in probably 1415 or 1418. And after that, they had effectively an open path down the Eastern Atlantic, Africa's western coast. And by the middle of the 1400s, the Portuguese were down there. And shortly after the middle of the 1400s, they were extracting Africans from continental Africa and taking them to islands in the Bight of Benin, to Principe and Sao Tome and other places like that, and already participating in what later became the Atlantic slave trade. So that's what Walter Rodney was amongst the first to study in seriously archival research. Walter looked in detail at Spanish archives, at Portuguese archives, the archives of the Vatican, of archives in France and archives in the United Kingdom, in order to do this piece of work, which is to look at what he calls the Upper Guinea Coast over a period from the 1400s to the late 1800s or whatever. So when Walter returns to the Caribbean, he is an already fully formed activist, because amongst the things that he's already done is studied with other Caribbeanists and Caribbean intellectuals, budding ones, all young like him, at the feet of C.L.R. James here in London. But he's also read an incredible amount of literature, as well as completing a brilliant PhD. Nobody doubted his brilliance, and as I say, unmodified it was adopted by the Oxford University Press and had been out since 1970, 2 years after he finished the document, maybe slightly more than two. Let's leave that to one side. So this is who Walter was, incredibly fully politicized and incredibly fully equipped academically and intellectually. He engaged in Jamaica when he returned there, now as a lecturer in African history primarily, with the masses of urban and rural Jamaica. The mode of his engagement didn't suit imperialism, and certainly didn't suit the Jamaican ruling class, which is in alliance with imperialism. And so in 1968, after less than a year of teaching at Mona, Walter went to Canada to give a speech at a, if you like, Black Power international gathering. And when he returned to Jamaica, he found that the government of the island had declared him persona non grata and effectively told him and his family that they have to leave the island. Now, what the government did gave Walter much more publicity and credence than he might in fact have had. But it's clear that he had enough for his ex-student colleagues, some of his now early university career colleagues, and people on the street, the men and women, especially the brethren and sistren on the gully banks of Jamaica, who he had taken or attempted to take, was in the process of taking African history and African consciousness to. And just as in 1937, 38, Richard Hart had discovered the craving that African Jamaicans have for African Jamaican history. That's how, in fact, Richard Hart got into researching slave resistance, because as a student in his father's library, he picked up some material and chose to share this on the platform of the early PNP, only to find that you couldn't hear a pin drop as he spoke about the history of Caribbean, in this case primarily Jamaican, resistance. And so, as I say, this was in late 30s. So long before Dick Hart, Walter, long before Rodney, Dick Hart had discovered the hunger of the Caribbean masses for Caribbean history, and Caribbean history of not wholly another kind had also been imparted by people like C.L.R. James and like Eric Williams. Eric Williams, as fine scholar, terrible neocolonialist, but he had taught publicly out of his grand store of knowledge, and he was incredibly knowledgeable, got an incredible degree from whichever of the Oxbridge places he was at. They hadn't seen anything quite like that before. And then he applied for what is allegedly their best schools, All Souls. And because one of the ways in which you get into All Souls is that you have to go to something called a dinner, at which the speaking is in French. Williams himself tells us that in this dinner, he made a small error in French, and the whole of the gathering simply guffawed at his error, and they didn't give him the office within All Souls, to which he was obviously manifestly entitled. So, back to Walter. Having been excluded from the Jamaican neo-colony, in a moment of terrible reaction, when they were doing awful things to Rastafari in the ghetto, including shooting them down, Walter left the island. There's evidence that he spent a little time in Cuba. There's evidence that he spent some time in the United States of America at that time. And there's evidence also that he spent some time in the UK. Importantly, he then got a job, a second job now, in Tanzania, and spent the years from maybe 69 in Tanzania. By that time, incidentally, he had been researching the book for which he is best known, which is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And yes, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And importantly, this is a key text in the constituting of post-Second World War revolutionary Pan-Africanism, because what Walter does is to show that not only during colonialism, but in the period after colonialism, which people tend to call wrongly post-colonialism, the imperialists had managed to constitute structures that enabled them to extract resources from the colonies in exactly the way, and indeed in less suspect ways, less immediately visually suspect ways, because it didn't seem to be based on force anymore. That is how they had got the first tranche of the resources via enslavement and invasion and so on. Now, in the period after the Second World War, they had leaderships who were ready to sign up to all kinds of bogus agreements. It doesn't matter where you're looking. Look at South Africa, where all of the gold, all of the diamonds, all of the platinum is in the hands of multinationals from here. Look at Jamaica, where all of the bauxite, which is now effectively exhausted, was in the hands of the neocolonialist entities from the United States and Canada. And those entities have exhausted the bauxite. What they've left is at least one poisoned riverbed, major river, poisoned the bottom of it. This is not wild talk, it's actually true. They've left several major lakes of poisonous mud. And now that the bauxite, and the other thing that they've left is topsoil free, gigantic areas of the island in such parishes as St. Anne and St. Elizabeth, where agriculture can't any longer be properly conducted because the topsoil has gone. They have also left bauxite to be mined, but fundamentally, importantly, not mined in the highlands of Jamaica, in the cockpit country, in the top of the Blue Mountains, because the Blue Mountains run down the middle of Jamaica, and any mining of bauxite in hills and mountains, a gigantic high mountain, 7,400 feet, something like that, big high mountain. But that's the watershed of the island, supplies the water via aquifers and rivers for the whole of the island. And it is not a place where it is in the interest of the people in the lowlands or the people in the highlands for bauxite to be taken out of there. You will hear arguments that that the reason not to interfere with those lands is because some of them are maroon lands. I don't say it's a valueless or erroneous argument. It's not the crucial one. The crucial one is the extent to which mining for bauxite in the highlands of Jamaica will endanger the water supply to the people on the lowlands and endanger people in the mountains, the highlands as well. That is amongst the things that Walter Rodney brought attention to in his very important book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But it seems to me important that we recognize just how otherwise productive he was. And one major insight of his, which I never failed to take the opportunity to share. Walter gave a talk somewhere in the States, long time ago, obviously a long time ago because he died 40 years ago. The talk was reproduced in a journal called Ufahamu. And that in that speech, that became an article in that journal, Walter makes clear something that I had not understood up until that point, which is that foreign direct capital investment is not investment at all. That what happens is that there's a pretend investment process in which money may or may not be transferred, but if money is transferred, it's taken back fairly directly, either via taxation or something called amortization. And there is an outrageous instance of this in the instance now before our eyes of the extraction of Guyanese bauxite. Sorry, I didn't mean bauxite, I meant oil and gas. Guyana, of course, also has bauxite. But the oil and gas is in deep waters off Guyana's shore, probably connected to the same veins that enrich Venezuela in oil, if not in any other respect. That oil has been taken possession of on the basis of agreements entered into by both the Indian and African government. First the African government, which the Indian opposition critiqued, and then when they won power, they fully embraced it. And there's a myth that the Guyanese people are going to be enriched by it, but the figures are clear that it actually makes no sense, that Guyana shouldn't allow itself, as is happening, to be deceived into believing that if it uses gas, it can provide heating and lighting, especially heating, to its population. Solar energy is available cheaply. All it has to be is to be harvested. And the reason the companies are so keen, along with some international organizations, to encourage the Guyanese to embrace gas is that the gas would otherwise be flared wastefully and environmentally dangerously. And so it is in the interest of the companies to persuade the Guyanese government and people that they should be using this gas. But it makes absolutely no sense. It's a pollutant. And the final big point is just how dangerous this exploration is. I repeat, it's in very deep waters off Guyana, and there is evidence that the gas and oil companies are using old equipment, that they're taking out more than they're contracted to do with the government. In other words, they're acting manifestly dangerously. There is no supervision by the Guyanese government, and so something could go wrong. And if something goes wrong, it will be a serious something which will pollute the whole of the Caribbean region. Now, because our leaderships are, without exception, the exception being Cuba, which we will leave to one side, the leaderships in our territories haven't protested in any way about this alleged enrichment of Guyana from a process that involves effectively transferring the ownership of something that up until this point was owned by Guyana and its people, transferred into the hands of some foreign companies, all of which have arrangements whereby what is taken out of the ground or from under the sea a big part of that will pay for the investment, and some of the oil is being left to Guyana. But what is being left to Guyana is not such as will enrich the Guyanese masses. The whole thing shouldn't be being undertaken at all. And if Guyanese or African people generally read Walter on this matter, the Ufahamu article is the crucial one. What they would know is that what the governments of Guyana, Indian and African, have entered into with foreign oil and gas companies is idiotic and wrong. Other African countries, as we speak, including Namibia, are contemplating the same kind of agreement, which, at the expense of the territory and people involved, transfers resources that belong to it to others and pay for the process of extraction ourselves, rather than actually allegedly receiving the vast quantities of capital. So that insight on the nature of the relationship between our territories in Africa or the Caribbean or South America or parts of Asia, especially South Asia, that relationship has to be fully understood and fundamentally rejected, because there is nothing in it. On Walter's account, which is a truthful and insightful account, has nothing in it for us. Now, Walter, as I said, mastered a number of terrains. His mastery of enslavement on the continental African terrain is demonstrated in two articles in, I think, volume 4 of the Cambridge History of Africa. And what is clear, and also in a long article in Joseph Inikori's book, Forced Migration. So Walter made himself into a world expert, a genuine one. Nobody doubts his scholarly, archivally based analytical achievement as a academic historian. So that work and achievement of his is there. Whilst in East Africa, Walter studied processes of resistance and processes of class formation throughout Africa, and particularly in East Africa, and may have to some extent got into trouble with the authorities there, because you can't do a proper and deep analysis of what was happening in those neo-colonies, even in the most progressive of them, and Tanzania certainly was the most progressive of them. But even in the most progressive of them, the processes of bureaucratization, the processes of undermining the lowest strata and classes of the society, the processes of imposing illegitimate or questionable or destructive party control applied to what Walter was seeing. And because he was seeing this in a debate that runs under the title The Silent Class Struggle, what Walter and others were doing was trying to understand and to document and analyze the processes of class formation, of class exploitation in a territory that had declared itself African socialist and was saying that everything it was doing was in the interest of the masses of this society. Walter and others thought they saw, and correctly thought they saw, evidence to the contrary. And at the point at which that was seriously articulated, there was bound to be some kind of a blowback. And to some extent, Walter achieved that. So at the moment of his departure from East Africa with the intent to go back to his native land, Guyana. Walter Rodney wrote one of the most important articles. I've spoken about this in an earlier presentation on here, and possibly too briefly, and I'll speak about it again too briefly. But it's his paper delivered not by him. He was either unwell or for some other reason did not make it back to Tanzania to present his paper at the Sixth Pan-African Congress in '74 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. But what happens in that is that Walter starts by saying what pan movements are, starts by saying that a key facet of approaching any nationalism is to have a clear understanding of what class, what social class within the nation or the nation in construction is in charge of the process, and that will dictate the direction that the liberation stroke revolutionary process takes, and that will dictate whether the forces and classes at the bottom of the society benefit from that process or are wrapped up in neocolonial bureaucracy as a result. Walter did more than that in that important article. He focused on the political, economic, and cultural defects of what by now has constituted itself as the neocolonial petty bourgeoisie. The leadership of countries like Tanzania, like Ethiopia, which had the odd form of being a monarch, an ancient monarchy, but elsewhere in Africa and elsewhere in the Caribbean, all of these places getting independence, flag independence at a pace. All of these places were being reproduced as neocolonies, effectively as instruments of white power, of imperialism against the masses of African everywhere in which these entities manifested. Walter speaks to that mercilessly in this article. He talks about the extent to which, while if you look at the emerging nationalities in Europe in the 19th century and the early 20th century, you see something of a dynamic. Obviously, they're exploitative. Obviously, a lot of their wealth and achievement depends on relationship with the colonies. But even taking that into account, it is still the case, and Walter is right to argue it, that that when you look at those people, they are creative, they know what they're doing, they're organizing a nation state to benefit in themselves and their people in their interests. By contrast, he says, when you look at the neocolonial petty bourgeoisie, you see uncreative, you see people with incomprehension of their own situation, you see people ready and willing to sell out to every impossible or minimalist offer that is made available, and you see people that effectively all they can do is import export, and that when it comes to understanding anything else, their defects matter and matter profoundly, because they sign and enter into agreements and processes that benefit entirely white power, the terrorist powers of the North, and fundamentally undermine and disbenefit the masses of the people of the so-called global South and certainly Africa. So Walter's work on that matter is of fundamental importance, just as, and it takes Kwame Nkrumah's work on that issue to, in a way, a slightly higher level, not slightly, fundamentally higher level, which is not to talk down what Kwame Nkrumah had done in his very, very, very important book. But there's some other stuff that we have to realize about Walter's productive outcome. In returning to Guyana in 1974-5, Walter made himself into a proper academic and intellectual and political expert on the history of Guyana. And so if you look at his publications relating to that, there is stuff in a journal called the Georgetown Review. He has pamphlet after pamphlet that are now difficult to obtain. And eventually, the first volume of his History of the Guyanese Working People, 1881 to 1885, became available. And it was the first volume of a number of volumes that he intended. He was killed before it was completed, and very important Guyanese sister called Medai, some of whose work is published in The Pointers to Change the World, Sister Medai, and she is the one who, working closely with Walter during his lifetime, finished off his book on the Guyanese working class after he had passed and brought it to publication here. But Walter wasn't just working profoundly as a historian on Guyana. And the profundity of that historical work needs to be understood. And let me make a point about the most profound aspect of Walter's work. Walter was operating in a setting where, after chattel enslavement, to which Africans and Africans alone in Guyana had been subjected, the white world brought in indentured labor from all over the place, and especially from the Indian subcontinent, as a kind of replacement labor force or supplementary labor force for the territory. And it used to be argued that from that very moment of arrival of the Indians, that there was conflict between the two groups. Walter, as I say, is the finest of archival historians, but he's also the finest of theoreticians. And the big achievement of his History of the Guyanese Working People, 1881 to 1905, is that he debunks that big lie about there having been race-based conflict between Indians and Africans in the period after emancipation, as the Indians were brought in and as the system made it hard for Black people to survive. Walter talks in some detail, incidentally, about the difficulties imposed upon Africans in the period immediately after the emancipation, how they tried to keep estates going and couldn't because of the expense of the machinery, because of this and that, because of the levels of taxation, because white power organized taxation so that the people at the bottom, the Black people, were taxed most heavily, and their taxation went into subsidizing the plantation economy and so on. The long story, but it's important that Walter's perspective on Guyanese history differs fundamentally from everybody else up to the point that he wrote. Other people, Kimani Nehusi and others, are now adding to it. But if you look carefully, and I have at least one unpublished article on this matter, what we see is that there's a body of literature, all of which, in the best imperialist way, says that there was always deadly conflict between Indians and Africans. And what Walter shows is that that is not true, that there were some conflicts, but they weren't always racial, that other kinds of conflicts also arose from the same kind of causes, and that, quote, the conflict between Indians and Africans in Guyana in the period that we're talking about, between, let us say, the 1830s and the 1930s, was, he uses the word piddling, little pool of pee. And it matters that we understand that, because Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese and African Guyanese have to work together on that terrain. I've always been surprised and shocked by the level of hatred that is manifest to me in my encounters with members of these two groups. But Walter Rodney's work does not contribute to that. Incidentally, I spoke of him having lots of other publications, including pamphlets. And amongst the things that he did was some radio talks, which became children's storybooks. And two of them were published during his lifetime. One of them is called Lakshmi, and looks at the cultural background of an Indian child. And the other one, the title of which has gone out of my head, but that one, as the first of the ones that he put out, was on the African Kofi Badu of Africa, is what that one is called. So, and there are at least 4 others. There were radio talks and converted into, I don't know if all of them ever came out, but so there is at the moment in Guyana an effort by some bright, mischievous Indo-Guyanese to characterize Walter Rodney's organization as anti-Indian. There is no truth in that rumor, and certainly it is not true of Walter's work on the history of Guyana and what he found to be an essential truth of the period of interaction between Indians and Africans when Indians arrived there, is an important lesson and perspective to understand. That truth also has to be combined with the fact that white power and white terror put a lot of money and other effort into breaking asunder the political alliance that had developed between Indians and Africans in the late 30s and 1940s and 50s, and pulled it asunder, compensated, bribed into existence race-based, ethnically based, if you will, political order in Guyana, which is still there. Now, before I come to how Walter died, and I hope I'm not using too much time, before I come to how Walter died, it's important that we understand that he also mastered not just African and African Caribbean reality, but he studied an extraordinary mind and capacity to read and to do archival work. He mastered the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, sufficiently in 1971-2, when Walter's published work and his main research was on Africa. Walter himself was saying to a colleague that his main area of specialism, not reflected in his publication, is the Chinese and Russian Revolution. He was studying them in a very, very serious way. And his work on the Russian Revolution was eventually assembled by Jesse Benjamin Kelly and some other people and published. I can't pretend yet to quite understand why and what it's important and what exactly is important about it, but it is evidence of the revolutionary depth of Walter's understanding of one of the main social processes of the 20th century, 2 of them, the Chinese and Russian revolutions, and incidentally, a third one, the Cuban Revolution, which he understood maximally and was writing about with massive, considerable insight of the sharpest quality. So The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World by Walter Rodney should be embraced and read. Now, before I talk briefly about how Walter died, it's important to just register, it seems to me, the extent to which he has come under attack. There's a brother, a bright man. I met him in the 1970s and I met him recently since, somebody called Dapo Ladimeji. Who has a journal, people can look it up, Ladimeji, Dapo Ladimeji. He has a journal. And in that journal, there's the very briefest of blog posts, which purports to address Walter Rodney. The basis of the piece by Dapo is that he, Dapo, couldn't understand how serious young Africans had come to honor and respect Walter Rodney so much, because he, Dapo, had uncovered two fundamental things about him. One is that what Dapo wrongly calls Walter's magnum opus, i.e. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, it's Walter's most popular works, but it's not his magnum opus. But what Dapo Ladimeji claimed to have done is to discover that Walter, in that book, rips off, unacknowledged, the approach of a German scholar who works on Chile and Brazil, called Andre Gunder Frank. It's not true. And I wrote an article showing that to be an untruth. The other claim that Dapo Ladimeji makes in his brief blog post, very tightly written, I repeat, Dapo is a bright man. The other claim that he makes is that Walter was a poor revolutionary. Now, that claim is much less deadly than the one that Walter was a plagiarist, which is a lie. So the plagiarist claim I've demonstrated to be untrue. The poor revolutionary claim is a matter of opinion. Whether a person is a great revolutionary, an effective revolutionary or not, there's some objective evidence. What have they achieved in terms of taking state power, in terms of defeating the class enemy, in terms of outmaneuvering the military forces of the class enemy, and so on. All of those would be ways to judge it. But what Dapo actually does is to rely on a single article by CLR James, and James is normally the finest of thinkers, and even in this piece, he's a very fine thinker. But in this book called Walter Rodney, Revolutionary and Scholar, A Tribute, there's an article in there by CLR James called Walter Rodney and the Question of Power. And it's a poor example of James's work. It's all over the place and it's egotistical. James places himself illegitimately at the start of a process in Caribbean intellectual and political development, which predates him by almost a century. And he doesn't bother with the stuff effectively that comes before him because it's inconvenient to the argument that he wishes to make in this particular article. And it's directed against Walter. Now, let me take a step back. When Walter Rodney went back to Guyana in 1974-5, he entered into a terrain which was controlled on behalf of imperialism by a party that was, whilst calling itself radical, and even revolutionary, was essentially counter-revolutionary. It was an agent of Western imperialism. It had been put in place in the preceding decades by the manipulation and money and bribery of British and American and maybe other colonial imperialist places. But the long and short of it is that as a result of that massive manipulation, a party primarily Indian, the PPP, and another party primarily African had emerged. And the Indian Prime Minister made a mistake of agreeing to allow for not first past the post voting, but voting of another kind. And that the outcome of that enabled the alternative Black Party, with some help from bribed other parts of the population and pro-imperialist other parts of the population and the leadership, to form a coalition government led by Forbes Burnham. And it is that entity that was running the Guyanese neocolonial state. It changed name from British Guyana to Guyana. It calls itself the Cooperative Republic. Ideological manipulation can done. But at fundament, what we're in the presence of is the most brutal neocolonial regime, Papadoki and so on, in key ways. People might know that in Guyana, there's a mass murder of African American and a few white people by somebody called Jim Jones, Jonestown. Those people were there because it suited imperialism, and it suited the Guyanese Black petty bourgeoisie. It suited Forbes Burnham and his henchmen to allow them in. But they were not the only ones who were there. He also let in another organization, the name of which escapes me briefly for the moment, and that entity provided the Burnham regime with hitmen and terrorist murderers and violent people of the worst kind, who killed, not many, injured, beat up people, broke up meetings, and so on. That is the atmosphere to which Walter Rodney returned. Now, upon his return, it's very well documented. He understood that communication mattered. So he tried to send in, and did in fact send in, all of the equipment that the party that he was intending to form, which he did form, the WPA, what was to need. None of that got into Guyana. In addition to that, Walter was denied the right to work in Guyana at his trade. And this is a man who, repeat, was qualified to be professor of history and head of any history department anywhere in the world. Sorbonne, Oxbridge, Ivy League, whatever, best, right? And yet, having been appointed to the history professorship in the university, the government said no, and the university backed down, which means that Walter didn't get his position and was not employed other in part than as taxi driver in Guyana. His wife, who's a brilliant nurse and now has a PhD in nursing, an important book, as her book has come from her PhD thesis. But when they allowed Walter's wife to work, they criticized him publicly for being a worthless fellow who was dependent on his wife. And he had children, 2 or 3 at the time. So it wasn't very easy. So he had to make his living by what the Trinidadians call scrunting. And in addition to that, by going abroad to lecture in the US, in Europe, and so on. And that is how Walter made his living in the 6 years that he was back in Guyana. Now, there's a very important little report, little article by a brother, Guyanese professor of linguistics and philosophy at the University of the West Indies, Mona. I know him personally. But he gave a lecture, which I didn't hear on the night. I was teaching in the same place, talking about Walter's time in Guyana. Devonish makes some very important points. One of them is that is to do with Walter's humility. Another of them is to do with the fact that in his first time in first period in Guyana, after 74, 75, Walter really wasn't known to the masses. And the way in which he became known to the masses was primarily because the government itself engineered a fire attack on one of its own buildings and charged Walter and some others with arson, which clearly they hadn't done. And defending themselves, making a politics nationally around that self-defense against state manipulation, brought Walter much more to the notice of the masses of the Guyanese people than would otherwise have been the case. The state having in the first instance deprived him of most of his means of communication, his photocopying equipment, his printing machinery, and so on and so forth. So here we have one of the world's leading Africanist and Pan-Africanist intellectuals doing political work in a terrible, murderous terrain. Walter, even though restricted or allegedly restricted in his movements by the Guyanese government, managed to go to many places, including to Grenada after the revolution, which happened in 1979. But he also managed to go at the same time that Burnham was there to the Zimbabwe independence celebration. And Burnham was greatly upset by the fact that Walter was much better known by him and much more honored and celebrated. And lots of people believe that the final decision to murder Walter Rodney was a function of that encounter between Walter and Burnham in Zimbabwe in mid-1980, because it was shortly after that that he was murdered. Now, there are people who all now don't accept that Burnham, who actually, by all accounts, is a nice, cultured, very on the surface, and even perhaps deep down, civilized fellow. So there are people who can't bring it to register in their hearts that Forbes killed Walter. I mentioned that Medai had helped to finalize Walter's book on the making of the Guyanese working class. Medai, and it's in her writing, not guessing, never believed that Forbes Burnham, who she knew as a child, her father was Burnham's doctor, and she never believed that Forbes had had anything to do with Walter's killing. And this is against the evidence, because the evidence is that a decision was made at the highest levels of the party and the state, and both the party and the state have at their apex none other than Forbes Burnham, and nothing happened of consequence that Burnham didn't know about. So it won't do to say that this or that person, much wickeder than Forbes, were the people who planned and executed the assassination of Walter Rodney. It really will not do to make that argument. We knew at the time that the Forbes-Burnham government arranged for Walter to be supplied with something that was supposed to be a radio. It turned out to be a bomb. They knew exactly how it was supposed to kill him. Walter had been given instruction by the agent of the state as to how to place what was a bomb on his lap while he attempted a piece of communication with what was supposed to be a radio. He wasn't holding it exactly as he should have. So the force of the blast went down and into his stomach, killing him in that way, but his face was left intact. And the government's plan was that Walter's face would have been destroyed. So the government, for Burnham propaganda material, and they put out propaganda material about finding this unidentifiable man blown up and killed in front of the prison, showed that they knew exactly how he was to die, showed that they were fully complicit in it, and in any serious analysis of how the Guyana regime ran, nothing of consequence happened of which Forbes Burnham was not aware and did not approve. So Walter Rodney was murdered in June of 1980 at the age of 1938, and he made an extraordinarily wide and deep contribution to understanding several terrains of African existence. He participated crucially in sharpening our understanding of neocolonialism. He helped us crucially to understand the meaninglessness from the point of view of benefits to people at the bottom of the society of what is called external capitalist investment. Walter, incident, was also interested in cultural matters, so he has a body of work that embraces African education and other aspects of African culture. A genuinely remarkable man, as remarkable in every respect, perhaps even more so than Kwame Nkrumah, and well worth, really genuinely well worth our spending time understanding as deeply as we can what Walter Rodney did with his very short life. Thank you.
Give thanks, Elder Cecil. Insightful as always, and though not, delving as deeply into the scheduled topic, insightful nonetheless. And I think maybe, especially for those who may not be fully in tune with the life and legacy of Baba Walter Rodney, that exposition is probably a necessary one before even getting into differences between these two great historical figures. So I will ask you some questions about that, however. But before that, let me just say, brothers and sisters,
I'm happy to try to answer your deep questions.
No problem. And I do want to say that Walter Rodney, for those who are looking to increase and deepen their political education from a Pan-African perspective, Walter Rodney is indispensable. Walter Rodney is everything that Walter Rodney has written is must read. And it doesn't matter whether you agree with every line or every sentence or not. That doesn't matter. You must read Walter Rodney. He is essential to the thing. And I'll give you one reason as to why, without getting into the history necessarily. In how Europe underdeveloped Africa, the first chapter engages in an exploration of development and the concept of development, different forms of development, and how we should be considering development, from a Pan-African and a revolutionary perspective. That chapter alone is extremely important. And we haven't got to the history yet, right? But I'm saying, as far as our current understanding and political trajectory goes, the insight in terms of the issue of development is extremely relevant today. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? And so I just want to
agree with you more, my brother.
Yes,
couldn't agree with you more, and it matters because of the way in which the notion development and underdevelopment came to be used to characterize the alleged first world and the parts of the world from which we come, which the first world exploits. So understanding what that notion means, those notions, development and underdevelopment, and how even when we're in the presence of something called growth, we might not be experiencing any significant development because of what that requires if it's to be real.
Exactly. And I'm even doing some new research on that in terms of how the term development became popular in politics from a media point of view, under certain American presidents. So we'll get into that in another session. Yeah, I also want to say that Groundings with My Brothers is an essential read as well. Yeah, and this is if I was to say. I was about to say, which is probably an incorrect statement, but a lot of the nationalists love this book, for good reason. But I was going to say it's probably their favorite Walter Rodney book, but I don't think that's probably the case. I think that among all strands of Pan-Africanism, including the nationalists, How You're Underdeveloped Africa is the one that people would regard as the magnum opus.
That's the best known book by far. Best known book by far.
But as far as an analysis of Jamaican society and the importance of Rastafari and what Rastafari had to offer the Pan-African movement, this is essential reading as well. I'm going to come back to decolonial Marxism. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Which I didn't really mention, but yeah.
No. I'm gonna read from it in a second. I don't have a physical copy of it, but I have it on audio book. Yeah. By the way, how you're underdeveloped. Yes, how you're underdeveloped Africa. Groundings with My Brothers and Decolonial Marxism are available as audiobooks for those who are into the audiobook thing. Yeah, so do check that out. This one, the Russian Revolution is not available as an audiobook as yet, and I have not as yet read this one either. No. But I'm going to ask you some questions about this as well, Elder Cecil. But yes, all right. So I was wanting to highlight that for those who want to get deeper into Walter Rodney and political education through the lens, and through the work of Baba Walter Rodney. Now, Elder Cecil, where I think it might be good to start is to hear the voice of Walter Rodney himself, and this actually relates to some of his critiques of the neocolonial societies that were developing on the African continent, and he also includes maybe a window into some of his critiques of NKRUMAH, but not just NKRUMAH. So maybe and I'll invite your response to this after I've played the video. Okay.
Yes, man. So looking forward to that.
So I'm going to play a video where we hear the voice of Walter Rodney, and I will encourage everybody for listening to this speech. It's about 1 hour and 15 minutes long, and it's called "Crisis from the Periphery." And he's delving into an analysis of how our societies in Africa and the Caribbean had been developing since so-called independence. And it's an extremely critical exposition. But I'm just going to play this and hear what else has to say about it afterwards.
Now, for Africa, let us exclude for the moment the direct intervention of multinational capital and concentrate on the political scene, where undoubtedly the indigenous state has an autonomous capacity, and it has a capacity to wage struggle on behalf of its own class vis-a-vis the workers and peasants of Africa and the Caribbean. And in that context, we therefore need to identify this social group, the leading social group, which will both command the struggle, provide the organizational basis for the struggle, provide the ideological underpinnings of the struggle. And we can proceed inferentially, we can exclude one group as a group that is not operative and is not functioning and cannot historically function anymore to lead the African people and to lead the Caribbean people. And that is the so-called middle class, the petty bourgeoisie. Let us at least put that myth to rest. The petty bourgeoisie as a class is unable constitutionally to lead any third world country anywhere except the destruction. That class was born originally, located, spawned by imperialism and capitalism. Its members, of course, do have a certain choice to a limited extent. They are fluid. But as a class, their intervention in the historical process has been to lead movements, mass movements, has been to lead populist movements. And they have imposed their own stamp on these populist movements. And they have stood as a barrier between the working people and the state, between the working people and the elaboration of a true working class ideology, between the working people and the development of a working class organization. All of these groups, without exception, and this includes some who will be considered as more progressive than others. It will include the NKRUMAHs and the Sekou Tourés and the Nereris, as well as the plethora of other reactionaries, of the real reactionaries in Africa and the Caribbean. They have organizationally established the hegemony of the petty bourgeoisie over the working class and the peasantry. All of these political parties, all of these state systems represent petty bourgeois hegemony over the working class. And if the petty bourgeois has a role, as one should hope, at least I would hope so for my own sake, being located in that class. If we have a role, it has to do with the shift of the initiative into the hands of workers and peasants. And then for a change, we begin to serve those classes. Because mostly we have been serving other classes anyhow. Mostly we have been serving the capitalist class. So for a change, we may begin to service the working people, service the working class. But to do so,
I'm going to pause it there. And for those who may be lost in some of the jargon, let me just explain, right? What Baba Walter Rodney is saying is that effectively, what happened in the near-colonial era, which is often referred to as the post-colonial era, a particular class emerged among us in our own nations, in Africa and the Caribbean. And that class imposed its will, which he identifies as the middle class, imposed its desires on the masses of the people and ascended up the social ladder on the backs of the masses of the people and effectively betrayed the masses of the people, which he refers to as the working class. And I won't go into some of my challenge. I might challenge some of his designations here, but that's not important at the moment. Yeah, but his use of the working class will refer to the masses of the people, and then basically betrayed the interest of the masses of the people for their own ascendancy. Now, I think that most people would agree that has taken place for the most part, within Africa and the Caribbean, within our societies in Africa and the Caribbean. Where people might have some issue is the fact that he includes Nyerere and Sekou Touré and NKRUMAH, and he even identifies himself as a member of that class, although he was not a head of state, right? So my question for you, Elder Cecil, is to what extent is that critique or that analysis a fair one in relation to our ancestors who we would celebrate as those who actually fought on our behalf? So and so before you answer, Elder Cecil, just to give some context to that as well, just to give some context, Elder Cecil, because the other side to this is that much of the story, for those who know the history of NKRUMAH, his story is told within the context of him actually leaving, a formation known as the United Gold Coast Convention, because of the fact that it was not addressing the issues of the masses, or as Walter Rodney would put it, the working class, and starting a new party that was designed specifically to represent those interests. So it might sound counterintuitive to somebody, especially an Nkrumahist, to hear a critique such as that from Walter Rodney. What would you say to that?
Okay, there can be no doubt that politics being what it was, there were some reactionary African leaders, overt in the case of Banda, and more concealed in other cases, and then some that counted left or most progressive, like Nkrumah, Secretary, and Nyerere. There's no doubting the reality of that. And then the question is, how is it to be challenged or questioned? If you take Nyerere, his failure to support Nkrumah in '63 at the founding conference of the UNIA, sorry, the OAU defines for me his politics, where he's effectively in the camp of the class and the external forces that want Africa to have the form that it presently has, which was inaugurated then or approved by Africans at that moment. So, and all of them, these three now, have limitations that, if we are to move forward, have to be identified and critiqued. And I think that is what Walter is doing, coming from a moment slightly after them and coming from a richer appreciation of the nature of the transformation that is necessary. Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Secretary, to a considerable extent, compromised, and Nkrumah especially, with the structure that he inherited. And the argument can be made, no argument can be made that he replaced the prior anti-colonial forces and that his was much more progressive than them. And then the question is, what exactly was his place in the process, and what were its limitations? And at the point at which we ask that question, it takes us back to a proposition that I'm advancing, which is that it doesn't matter whether the process was peaceful or armed struggle, the outcome has been the same. And there are instances, Ghana was one, where the outcome was visible before Nkrumah was overthrown. So that's what I think Walter is trying to draw attention to. He doesn't have to have got it 100% right, but there is an issue about how or where the people who we most admire in the anti-colonial struggle, what the limitations of the position that they ended up in, and that they advanced sometimes quite consciously and deliberately, what those positions were. And so I think that's what Walter is doing quite legitimately.
So then what in your humble estimation, because as I've said previously, I'm the more I learn about the challenges of that era, even where I ideologically disagree, with certain of our leaders and our ancestors, I'm slow to critique, because the challenges of the time were so immense, that I don't know if many of us will have surpassed them, given those challenges, right? if we were put in those positions, right? And so in that, but that's not that is, by the way, not to negate what you have said in terms of having to engage in critical analysis. That's necessary, But to what extent then would you say? So, and for example, I know many people criticize, and I think these are justifiable criticisms, the fact of Nkrumah's failure, for example, to reform the army sufficiently, for example. Significant aspects of the army were still under effectively colonial control.
And the civil service.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? And then you have like, and that was symbolic, by the way, of the fact that and the, Nana Nketiah the fifth, yeah, said that I heard him speak one time, and he was basically saying that when Nkrumah declared Ghana independent, right, made the rousing speech, and he announced the singing of the national anthem and the playing of the national anthem, and the person who was conducting the band that was playing the national anthem at that moment was an old colonial army officer. Yeah. So the person that was, you know, well, yeah. So that's quite symbolic. Yeah. So that's symbolic of that. At the same time, there are other challenges. For example, him going into business with Kaiser Aluminium, and them kind of things there, which you know, one might disagree with and critique and so on and so forth, but might understand within the challenges, the context of the challenges that he was dealing with and what he was trying to achieve at the time. So to what extent would you say the shortcomings of Nkrumah in the context of Walter Rodney's critique were of his own kind of limitations coming from the quote unquote middle class, or were more a reflection of him trying to negotiate the challenges of his time?
Okay. It's a difficult one. My view is that we have to have a view of what was objectively necessary. And what was objectively necessary in Africa in that anti-colonial moment was an anti-colonial revolution, which wasn't just about getting rid of the formalities of colonialism. It, in other words, the Chinese faced the same set of forces: imperialism penetrating China via a Chinese bourgeoisie, a civil war, a revolution, the defeat of that whole assemblage of power, combined internal and external. Now, there is no question but that Africa, continental Africa, required such a revolution, and that the failure to attempt it then may mean that we will never be able to liberate ourselves from those forces that are reinforcing themselves always and as we speak, and using again as we speak the neocolonial order, so that when to keep it real and immediate, when 3 African countries, one after another, reject French neocolonialism, American and other Western neocolonialism has in place in ECOWAS enough Africans who think or say that what is happening is an assault on democracy, that they need to even militarily attack the 3 leaders,
Sahel states,
you know, Guinea, you'll know, the 3 countries. And then it matters that in this moment also we've had an election in Senegal where the man who won was speaking very radically, and now seems to be backtracking on all of that and to be just a younger version of the older neocolonialists who are in the rest of ECOWAS. And so for me, that's a challenge. Not were conditions difficult. Of course, conditions were difficult. Not that there were terrible choices to be made. Of course, there were terrible choices to be made. But if the correct choice isn't to see the necessity for and to pursue effectively the African Revolution, a revolution directed like the Chinese Revolution at ending not colonialism, but imperialism and capitalism in continental Africa, we're going to end up, as we have, the slaves to neocolonialism, which is a variant of imperialism, without any clear options for challenge. Because you know, if as has occurred in those three countries, the army has sided with the people. The army has sided with the people. Yes, or the people have sided with the army. But at every point where the army does not side with the people, you have an irremovable force, which is imperialism manifesting as neocolonialism, ready to do the dirty on the people. And you know, it really doesn't matter where you're looking at, Egypt or South Africa, where the current now about national government order before that slaughtered Africans at Maracana on a daily basis, slaughtering shack dwellers, strugglers over all kinds of things. And as it failed to satisfy the people, and the people voted against it, not voted it out, but voted so that it couldn't have the kind of majority it needed, it's entered into an alliance with white folk. So the failure of the progressives to manage in the 50s and 60s, which is to complete the African Revolution, is, I think, what Rodney is talking about.
Give thanks, I'll come back to that shortly. Just to say, brothers and sisters, if you want to ask a question to Ola Cecil, please at Kimbunga Media in your comment or your question in the chat, and I will come to it and read it. There's at least one, and I'll come to you shortly. If we have some time after I've asked some questions, I will also share the link for ones to come true. And if you desperately want to come true, then please notify me in the chat as well, and I'll do my best to make space for that to take place. Right. I'm going to share my screen now. Orlando. Okay, and read from a couple stanzas from decolonial Marxism, and the in fact, before I read the thing, Elder Cecil, sometime you mentioned this in a previous session, and you criticized the title, and if I'm not mistaken, you may have also criticized the publishers, who are Verso Books, I didn't mean to ask you about it at the time because I noticed it, but it might have been missed. I wanted to know what your contention with the title might be, and the publishers, if there is a contention with the publishers.
All right. The UK publishers of Rodney are substituting at his family's request for Bogle Overture, which they have historic issues with. I'll say that and say nothing further about it.
Okay, understood.
So I don't have any problem with the publishers as such, because they are the Rodney family's chosen publishers in the UK and now elsewhere, possibly in the US, elsewhere in the US, and one has to respect that. Now, at that point, it is possible to spot difficulties that Rodney is in. Rodney's in a difficulty arising from the fact that he's so important that white left, and the white left forces don't actually have to be white, they can be black. So there's a little book. I know this young man. He's bright. A nice young man, right? And very bright. He's called Chinedu Chikwanda. His name is there. And he published an article in a white left journal, the Journal of African Marxism, which was, and I critiqued it, and they published my thing, which was in effect an echoing of the Eurocentric response to Walter, because Walter, both in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and elsewhere in his work, says, and it's correct to say, that white working people in the metropoles benefited from colonialism and continued to benefit massively from the relationship between us and our resources and them here. Now, there's no denying that. And at the points at which it's denied, it has to be done via a position that has to be structurally Eurocentric, because it's refusing to look at objective reality, because that undermines, to some extent, Marx's heroes in history, which is the European proletariat. Right? The European proletariat, the critique that we have of them, and I'm not anti-European proletariat, but the critique that we have of them is twofold. One is that they continue to benefit from and not to challenge the relationship between their economic order and Africa and Asia and Latin America. So they benefit from that. And the other thing, I've got the other point that I was going to make, but let me illustrate how it works. There's a British novelist called Jane Austen, and she has a novel called Mansfield Park. Very early in that novel, one of the characters is in economic desperation. She's had lots of children. She had a bad marriage and has had lots of children, and they're very poor. And she writes to her sister's husband to ask for help. And what does she want help for? She wants help for her oldest son, who needs a position in the world and is fit and ready and bright. And she says, maybe you can find him a place in India. Maybe you can find him a place at Chatham, which is the Navy. Or maybe you can find a place for him on your West Indian estates. And all of that in less than a paragraph shows how the people at the bottom of the society had the option of going and participating in the exploitation as a way of elevating themselves. That's what Clive did. That's what the man who wrote In Miserable Slavery, that terrible man who rapes all those women in Jamaica and then wrote it down. Thistlewood, right? Thistlewood, they don't come from anywhere. They don't come from anywhere, but they go there and So, and it's not just the ones who become rich, the ones who have factory jobs here, who are in the Navy and the Army, and who are in the factories, are part of a process of exploitation. And it is cannot be anti-Marxist to recognize that, and it is racist and Eurocentric to deny or attack Walter Rodney when he makes what is fundamentally a correct point, where the evidence is massive and indisputable. Right. So Walter. Right. So the white left, not his publishing house, but other parts of the white left. So there's a book out by somebody called Leo Zellick, who is called Walter Rodney, Revolutionary for Our Time. And I haven't fully read it yet, but there's a whole heap of things. Zellick doesn't understand Guyana. Zellick doesn't understand what Walter does in his book on the Guyanese working class with the history of Guyana. And Zellick is a big spokesman of the section of the white left that has an interest, because they think they're defending Marxism, of saying that Walter is wrong with regard to the extent of the benefit to which the white working class got from and continues to get from the connection to imperialism. Yeah. Now, Walter's in trouble in those regards, but he's also in trouble with his wonderful family. There is a film on Walter. I don't know if you saw it. It was shown at the
No,
at the
I missed
BFI.
it. Yeah,
Did you come to
I
the?
missed it. No, my father was there,
The
but
film
yeah,
on
I
Walter.
missed it, unfortunately.
Yeah, it has 100% approval of the family,
Right.
as does anti-colonial Marxism, right? And the problem is that his family's politics are actually less progressive and less revolutionary than his.
Right. Understood.
And so they put out stuff that sells their perception of who Walter was, rather than the revolutionary reality of what Walter was.
Right.
And that has effects which are going to be felt for some time.
I understand.
Because Walter will be de-revolutionized to an extent. He's so good and so deep that he can't really be de-revolutionized, but he can be put into a framework that calls him a civil rights
activist,
civil rights organizer, or that kind of thing. Doesn't actually see that that's not the terrain you're on at all, or that he was on at all.
Right. And just to home in on the title itself, Decolonial Marxism. Did you have a problem with that title? And if so, what was the problem with the title that you?
Okay. I don't want to make a big thing of the book title.
Right.
The point I just made is that how Walter's political practice, which is his combination of theory and practice, how that is viewed matters. And I'm not at all convinced that his family and those closest to them have a sufficiently revolutionary understanding of Walter's work. And right. And then what exactly is decolonial Marxism? Right. Walter wasn't concerned with decolonization. Walter was concerned with the fight against imperialism, the defeat of imperialism. And that's the thrust of his work. So it's not that colonialism isn't residual, but if you just focus on colonialism, including saying that it's ending not in neocolonialism but post-colonialism, you're in serious trouble. And Walter wasn't in such trouble, but if he gets published within boards and backs that place him there, then it's going to be difficult to dig him back out.
Okay, I understand. Yeah. I was wondering because I thought, oh, that's interesting, because I saw Decolonial Marxism, and then I saw the subtitle which said Essays from the Pan-African Revolution. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. And obviously I'm a nationalist, so my sensibilities were tingling at that moment in time, because it looked like they had made Pan-Africanism subordinate to Marxism at that point. So I was like, okay, that's an interesting one there. But I will say on this, there seems to be a growing. There's been a number of these. What's the word? Let's use the word contradictions. And I'm not going to use the word contradictions. There's been a number of these impositions recently, in recent years. One has been on the issue of the significance of the 1776 revolution in America, and there have been some African historians, most notably Gerald Horne, who have been referring to it as a counter-revolution, and the white left have been vexing him for that and coming at him for that as well. In the last few years, there's been a number of articles coming out of the white left, and I'm saying the white left as you have defined it, whether it's in whiteface or blackface, attacking Papa Garvey, Marcus Mosiah Garvey. There's been a few of those articles that I've seen, at least one other issue that, if I'm not mistaken, you were involved in. I think you wrote an article, but I can't remember what the issue was.
Never me.
I'm forgetting what. Yeah, no, there was something was written somewhere, and you responded to it, but I can't remember what you wrote something that responded to it, and I can't remember what the issue was. So forgive me for that. Well, I'm just highlighting the fact that
if the terrain is Walter's work, the two things that I've written to fight two pieces. One of them is the article by Chinedu in the Journal of African Marxism, and the other thing that I did was a long thing showing as firmly as I could that the attack on Walter in a journal owned by a very bright Nigerian, I think, gentleman, is which accuses him. I mentioned it already, and his name gone out of my head. But
Dapo,
which says that he's a poor revolutionary and a Dapo Ladimeji. Yes. My other piece is published in his journal, and the way he covers, he doesn't respond at all to my showing that his claim that Rodney was a poor revolutionary is based on a very poor James article, and he doesn't answer at all my argument that he is fundamentally dishonestly claim that he has evidence that Walter plagiarized somebody else, Gunda Frank, in his How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. What Dapo did instead was falsely to accuse me of two things. One was of being rude to him in the 70s at lectures that he used to deliver at London, the one near Baker Street, just across from there. That one, that university. And the other thing that he said, and you were at this. You remember when we had that film on Garvey by the brother Jamaican, about 3 years ago at the BFI.
Yeah.
Gus was on the stage. I was on the stage. The sister from Oxford was on there, and the film producer was there as well.
Yes, I remember. Yes.
Dapo says, and put in his journal, that I shouted him down during that session. Lie.
Okay.
What actually happened was that, and I didn't recognize him. I hadn't seen him for 30, maybe 40 years. So this brother came up who I didn't know. I was, remember, on the platform. It's very interactive. You had passionate points to make about Garvey and so on. So it's very interactive. And this man who I didn't recognize came up and said, it's a pity that there are no Africans on the stage. And what he meant was, it's a pity there are no continental Africans on the stage, because the stage was full of Africans. So that's what I responded to him to say. And I didn't have to shout him down, because half the people in the audience understood how wrong he was to say that there are no Africans up there. He published that in his journal, along with a lie that I was rude to him in the 70s at the Central London University, whatever it's now called. It used to be Central London Poly and all of that. It's gone through about 10 different names. But there's horrible dishonesty about, and it's being practiced by some black nationalist people, and by some white Marxist people, and by some black Marxist people, and also by Rodney's family. And it's difficult. There's an extra little task to try to save him from all those sometimes disguised assault that's coming at him from these various angles and portals.
I understand that. Give thanks for that, Elder Cecil. By the way, for anybody who wants to know the passionate point that I made, the film that Elder Cecil was referring to ends with a thanks and a tribute to Edward Seaga. And I thought that it was a travesty
Yes,
that any
that's
film,
what got you.
yeah,
That's one of the things that got you angry about that.
yeah, you know.
Yes.
No. Having said that, as far as documentaries on Papa Garvey go, it's not the worst of them. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. It's by far not the
I
worst.
know
Of
he's
them.
the worst film. The worst
You know?
film on Garvey is that Look for Me in the Whirlwind. That's a
Right.
direct attack on Garvey.
Yeah, the direct attack. You know what I'm saying? And it certainly wasn't that. Yeah.
Yes.
But I just thought that, you know, for whatever.
No. That film.
You know what I'm saying? Go ahead.
My difficulties with it. My difficulty with it, and it's a long time since we both saw it. You might have seen it since, I don't know. But,
I haven't. No. Yeah. I need to watch it again.
Not under the tribute to Mr. Seaga, and that I think was to do with his funding sources and him sucking up to Jamaica Labour Party and ruling class forces. Right. So, of course. So that objection of yours was legitimate, but he did things like calling Garvey a Black Moses.
Yeah.
Which is a discredited approach to Garvey. Somebody wrote a book.
About
Garvey of that title, which had been discredited long time ago. And some of his perspective of that kind, and in that kind of quarter, is
of course
less sound than it should be. But it's not a bad film, and by no means the worst of the many films on Garvey. And the worst one, in my view, just to repeat, is the one that's called Look for Me in the Whirlwind, which is
terrible.
It was funded by say again.
No, go ahead. I was just saying it's terrible. It's terrible.
No, it's funded by the US. It's funded by the US.
PBS.
Something public. Yes,
PBS.
Funded by PDS, and they wanted a version of Garvey, which they went to very great lengths to get. And Robert Hill helped them. A man in tight round glasses inside of the film helped them, and the person who produced it also helped them. Our friend Winston James, my friend Winston James, was interviewed at length about that film, and they cut him out to put in the line that they wanted to sell about Garvey's incompetence, his unwillingness to take advice, etc. It's a wicked film, and this thing about him being left in the grave by his father and falling off a platform in New York and so on. It's just pure wickedness.
Pure wickedness, yeah. All right, well let's get back to Rodney and NKRUMAH. And by the way, just except for to say that we got something. I've got something anyway preparing for the white leftists who have been attacking Papa Garvey recently. So stay tuned for that. We're still dealing with them. Right. I want to read from Decolonial Marxism now, and the specific essay in question is the one called Marxism and African Liberation. Yeah. And Baba Walter Rodney says, NKRUMAH spent a number of years during the 50s and right up to when he was overthrown, that would cover at least 10 years, in which he was searching for an ideology. He started out with this mixture of Marxism and Protestantism. He talked about Pan-Africanism. He went to conscientism, and then NKRUMAhism. And there was everything other than a straight understanding of socialism. Yeah, that's what he says. He goes on to say, we saw in Ghana that NKRUMAH. Oh, in fact, let me read the interim. He says, what were the actual consequences?
Let's stay. Cool. my brother. Let's stay with that one, because I think that as a description of, let's say, the confusions. There are two ways to approach NKRUMAH. You can go for the confusions and even betrayals that are involved in his life and work, or you can do something else, which is what I tried to do in that piece of mine that you put up online, to tell a story of his coherence. And at the end, we have somebody who understood neocolonialism at the end, we have somebody who understood class struggle and was saying that class struggle is necessary in Africa. In the end, we have somebody who knows and says that imperialism is the enemy of the African people and capitalism is the enemy of the African people. So, in his, despite the twists and turns and the funny, I mean, you probably know, because I think I probably said so somewhere to you. I was never impressed by consciousness. I may not even have read it properly. But so there is confusion. And I think it's our duty, and maybe Walter was not quite falling for that, but in that moment, what he was trying to do was say that we need to arrive at a clarity that wasn't always there in the evolving Kwame Nkrumah, but I don't know if he says in the thing that Nkrumah arrives at the last correct place in the last phase of his life.
He does in a way, so I'll read it so people can. No, that's fine. That's fine. No problem at all. But just so people can understand how Walter Rodney concluded it himself, I will read the next couple paragraphs. It said, "What were the actual consequences of this perception? That is the matter. That is what matters to us. Let us assume that he was searching for something. That he was searching for something African, and that he was trying to avoid the trap of adopting something alien. What were the practical consequences of this attempt to disassociate himself from an international socialist tradition? We saw in Ghana that Nkrumah steadfastly refused to accept that there were classes, that there were class contradictions in Ghana, that these class contradictions were fundamental. For years, Nkrumah went along with this mishmash of philosophy, which took some socialist premises, but which he refused to pursue to their logical conclusions. That one either had a capitalist system based upon private ownership of the means of production and alienation of products of people's labor, or one that had an alternative system which was completely different. And there was no way of juxtaposing and mixing these to create anything that was new and viable. The most significant test of this position was when Nkrumah himself was overthrown. After he was overthrown, he lived in Guinea-Conakry, and before he died, he wrote a small text titled Class Struggle in Africa. Now, so he does come to that conclusion. What I'm wondering, though, is if his trajectory in terms of or his analysis of Nkrumah's development is actually factually correct. And part of the reason why I'm saying that is because Nkrumah writes Neocolonialism in 1965. And he publishes it before he's actually overthrown. And in the book, he's detailing what is taking place on the African continent at that time and how the different formations are moving to install neocolonialism. So the book is full of class analysis, right? whatever you want to agree with or disagree with, but the book is full of. So is this a fair assessment of Nkrumah's development?
No.
Sorry. Just to clarify the point. What I'm saying is to say that Nkrumah only becomes aware of the importance of the class forces operating on the African continent and their importance after he's overthrown.
That's not what Walter says. Walter points to a certain confusion that was ideological, and you can't have confusion excepting there's a battle between positions, and one of the positions is the class one, and the other one is the nativist or African or whatever position, and those are present in the ideologically struggling Nkrumah. But there is no doubt that Nkrumah saw the enemy. what happened in Congo, he understood.
He understood, right?
And he understood it in class terms. He understood it in anti-imperialist terms, right?
Right.
So it's not. I don't think if Walter was focused differently, that
yes,
there is any sense that he didn't really know that these elements
right.
are also in
Right.
Nkrumah. So
Right.
it's what is said is to some extent dictated by what is found to be the case. It's dictated to some extent by what you want to find, which is that
Okay.
he was dominated by this confusion. But
Right.
you have to, and this is repetition, you have to recognize that the confusion had content, and it was a battle between various positions, ideologically, economically, politically, and that on the Marxist side of that confusion, the understanding of the nature of the world that Nkrumah had, and the nature of imperialist domination that Nkrumah had throughout his life and work was a very high level one, and not one that where he only arrives at a correct position. Right. In the autobiography, he says explicitly, I was influenced by Garvey and by Marxism, Leninism. That means something. And what follows immediately after that is what he means. And it doesn't reject class, and it focuses on the nature of the enemy. I mean, I need to reread those pages, but in my memory, that's what happens there. That is what is happening there.
Okay, understood. And there's so much. By the way, for those again who are looking to delve deeper into their political education, that chapter is a very good exposition from a Marxist perspective on some of the debates between nationalists and Marxists, and because of that, there are elements of it that I do disagree with. At the same time, like the beautiful thing about Walter Rodney is that you cannot read him without having to confront your own positions, and critique your own positions, and so to that extent, it's a necessary read, it's a necessary read, so do check it out, brothers and sisters. Go ahead.
Let me say something though about Walter. Walter was a true but critical believer in Marxism.
Yes,
right.
Yes,
there's no doubt about that. He's also very seriously an Africanist, and he combines these elegantly and tightly theoretically. But the problem that we enter into is just that he could say, not legitimately, that Nkrumah arrives at the correct position on class and Marx late. Right?
Yes.
Walter, the critical believer, never saw coming the fall of world communism, and
I was gonna ask about that.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing in his work about the underachievement of Marx's gravediggers of capitalism. And that's not there. Although I won't say 100% is not there, but it's less there than it should be because of the extent to which, critical though he is, Walter is a believer.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because obviously Walter already died before the fall of the Russian Revolution.
Yes,
and so but I'll come back to that. Let me just deal with this. Oh, by the way, I want to go to Walter Rodney in Guyana for a second, and just to say, the name of the group that you couldn't remember is the House of Israel. Along with Jim Jones.
That is indeed the name. Yes, thank you.
The other group that was important to go on with wickedness in the nation is the House of Israel. And
they were sorry, just to make it clear to the listeners who don't know, Jim Jones went out in the countryside and left Guyana politics alone broadly, but the House of Israel was in the capital and supplied thugs including knife-wielding thugs and gun-wielding thugs, to the Burnham regime. And they were an urban-originated African-American sect who were up to absolutely no good. In Guyana.
Now,
I haven't explored their origins back in the States, so I know less about them than I should do.
Yes, understood. I have not read Walter Rodney's History of Guyana, although I intend to. Some of his basic philosophy, though, as far as the racial question, is kind of alluded to in The Grounders in My Brothers, and especially in relation to the difference between the influx of Chinese and Indian indentured labor. He seems to, at least in Jamaican context, regard the Chinese differently to how he regards the Indians.
But there are a few of them.
But in terms of how they represent themselves in the colonial structure and in terms of class, he considers them very differently. Now the question now, and there are for those who are sorry, go ahead, Elsa, go ahead.
No, importantly, the Chinese came single sex, so they got sex from black women, right? And there's a whole mixed race. We call them China Royal in Jamaica. There's all of that. And because the Chinese went for sales, what are those shops called? Shops that were very close to the people. They had to, retail shops. The Chinese were selling shad and mackerel and flour and stuff in their in their shops that were right at the center of our communities. They had to relate to us in a different way. The Indians were taken onto the estates, and in Guyana, when they came off the estates, they went to rice, which incidentally we also did in West Africa, but we responded to the possibility of rice differently in Guyana to the Indian. So it's not that the Chinese are better. It is that the way they embrace and participate in the economy is fundamentally different from the way in which Indians were integrated and then found alternatives for themselves, which didn't involve necessarily direct sales to black people and so on, because they weren't running shop.
I understand, but here's the issue, because there are, as you will know, the racial politics of Guyana continue to be, very contentious to this day, as far as politics is concerned. And for those who want some to get further insight on that, there's a good brother called David Hines, who runs a channel called Politics 101. And so check that out. And he interviews a lot of African Guyanese who have been in the fight from long time and all them thing there. But Africans in Guyana are still fighting to be recognized as African. In fact, recently I learned that in law in Guyana, and in the criminal justice system, Africans in Guyana are still referred to as Negro. And so there are Africans who are fighting to have that changed today. This is not something 20 years ago. Seriously, this is a current issue in Guyana. And
you'd have thought that the Burnham regime would have addressed that.
No, not at all. But they're getting a fight now because the PPP is in power at the moment. Which is the party that is mostly supported by
very much so.
by Indians. And so there's all kinds of, and so there's a fight because now they want to change the name in law to Afro Guyanese, and the Africans are saying no, we want to be referred to as African Guyanese. Or something like that. No. So not Afro Guyanese. Sorry, Guyanese of African descent. And the Africans say no, we want to be referred to as African Guyanese. Guyanese of African descent. Now the question I have for you then, to what extent is class in Guyana racialized?
It's a big and difficult question. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in any place where races exist, even though, was it on this program that I was talking about what the white folk have done with race since the end of the Second World War? Maybe not. I think so. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think it was here. I think it might have been on. Anyway, leave that to one side. So in any place where the racial divide is real and affects social institutions, labor market, whatever. Some are going to be mixed up. So having said that, what you have in Guyana is Africans taken there as enslaved without consent or contract and exploited for quite a long time, and then let out of that system without any compensation or any assistance, and into a state of affairs where the system continued to be oppressive and obstructive, right? That's well documented in Walter's work. The Indians were brought in, horrible conditions. There's a book called A New System of Slavery. It's not actually a new system of slavery at all, but oppressive it certainly was. But it was with consent and contract, and the contract allowed return to India. The contract allowed they could get land in Guyana instead of returning to India. So imperialism privileged Indo-Guyanese over African Guyanese. And that is a site of anger, a cause of anger and resentment by African Guyanese. And I have to say, I don't know if the story is worth telling, but
go ahead.
Sometime in the early 70s, I went to visit Ron Phillips. You remember him? Maybe you didn't know him. It's Trevor and then brother. Very bright man. He led our delegation to the six pack in Dar. Amazing man. But I was visiting him. He's from Guyana, obviously, Phillips family. And there was present there in the thing. We're having a meal and a chat. A sister who was a doctor, African Guyanese, and Ron. And the passion, net hatred that African Guyanese have for Indians, that's when I first discovered how deep it is. And almost everything that I have since encountered confirms that hatred is real, and the scope for misunderstanding is amazing. So Indo-Guyanese at the moment are actually busy saying that the WPA was racist because it was arguing
the working people. The Working People's Alliance, just to clarify for listeners,
yes, Walter's party, and the argument is specious and dangerous and deadly, but it's being made by them because they don't see Africa and Africans as having any legitimate cultural identity, and to assert it is to be anti-Indian and racist.
Yes,
and they're saying
but Aaron Cecil, this is an interesting position to come to in a society where Indians do their utmost to hold on to their culture, their heritage, and identify themselves as Indian, right? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So even Chedi Jagan, what he was a prime minister and a president of Guyana, criticized Walter Rodney, who was expressly trying to bring the races together, so to speak, along working class lines, of being anti-Indian, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And this is the reason why I asked the question, because
Yes.
it seems that I mentioned David Hines a minute ago, and he was actually a member of the Working People's Alliance. Yeah, that still exists today. Yeah, and he was speaking to other members of the Working People's Alliance, long-standing members of the Working People's Alliance. Them all know Walter Rodney. They're students of Walter Rodney, lovers of Walter Rodney. And David Hines had to ask them, have we, in our pursuit of achieving working class unity, or let's say alliance, in Guyana, as Africans in Guyana, not paid enough attention to the assertion and affirmation of ourselves as Africans in Guyana and our own political interests? Have we substituted that and negated that to a degree based upon trying to achieve this thing? Yeah. And he was asking this question as an honest question to long-standing activists, right, in the nation. And the reason why I asked the question is because it seems to be the case, that Diwali is openly celebrated in Guyana, that the Indo-Guyanese identity, right, is asserted, and affirmed. You've got people in Guyana that, because I follow cricket, right, and when Indians from Guyana enter the cricket team, you know who them is because them have long Indian name, and they've been in Guyana for generations, right, at this point. So you can see there's an assertive attempt to maintain film identity. This is not a criticism, of them in this regard, right? They should do that, but it appears to be the case that whilst Indian identity doesn't negatively affect, is not perceived as an affront necessarily to African identity and or being Guyanese and or achieving and working in an alliance on working class lines with anybody else. The assertion of Africanness in the Guyanese context seems to erupt in all of these problems and difficulties, and charges of being anti-Guyanese, anti-Indian, and anti-working class, and anti-Guyanese, right, and all of these things. So can
no.
Yes, go ahead. Just consider those points and respond to them.
No, I haven't followed Hines. So I don't know what he's saying, but I hear you that he's asking former WPA people whether their politics negatively affected their Africanness. I, as it happens, don't think that it did. I think that where Guyana is concerned, Forbes Burnham party worked as an act of racial solidarity, African racial solidarity. And one of the reasons why Rodney had difficulty, people even thought that he was Indian because he was against Burnham. And only an Indian could be against Burnham. So, before they actually saw who he was. So the Africans, whether they've managed it economically and so on, is another matter. But they have defended their racial interests, sometimes to the point of illegitimacy, because the Burnham regime rigged elections and that kind of thing inapprovable on an industrial scale. So they remained in power by illegitimate means. And also they suppressed opposition, starting still about the Burnham party, by the means that we were talking about earlier, where they used the violence of that African American group and so on. And it wasn't just them who were violent; the police were violent, and the army was violent for in defense of the Guyanese state. So there's no question that in Guyana overall. By the way, Walter came to the UK, as he did frequently, and one of the times he spoke at Head Start, 25 West Green Road. I didn't, unfortunately, go to hear him, but the week after he spoke, I went, as I usually did, and Brother Garvey said, Walter doesn't understand race, right? And what was the essential Africanist position at the time, which is that we had, by hook or crook, to defend Guyana against the Indian man them. And Walter didn't believe that. So that's and without, I think, in any way fixing or misrepresenting the historical reality, found the record do not prove continuing conflict between Indians and Africans in Guyana, despite the way in which Indians were brought there, and despite the way in which they were privileged economically over Africans and so on. So it's a complicated terrain. I think that Walter's position on it has to be understood and integrated into the reality. One final point. How bright Indians in the Caribbean regard us is a matter of interest. As an academic, I've met one or two interesting ones of them. There's somebody called John Gaffer Laguerre, and very bright Indian guy. And he writes about us. He writes about Africans. And the position from which he writes about us is not one of respect at all. And so on. He's a UE academic. And the other one that I've discovered or encountered is somebody called David Scott. David Scott is a Jamaican who doesn't look all that Indian, from Sri Lanka. But he grew up with other friends of mine, including somebody called Nardi Edwards, who never saw his Indianness at all. Because of how they grew up as Jamaican budding intellectuals. Now, David rediscovered his Indian Sri Lankanness. Went and did a PhD in Sri Lanka to consolidate his Indian identity. And then he came back to the Caribbean and started a journal called Small Acts. And inside and outside of Small Acts, if you look, the work is based on a disparagement of African identity and the African place, the place of African culture and African self-assertion in the Caribbean nationalist anti-colonial project. And it's actually worth reading from that point of view, because it's a clear example of the problems that we Africans have with Indians who know a lot about us, come out of the same space, but feel willing and able to disparage us as a starting point for what they want to do. That's a summary of my view of what David's work is.
I hear you, so yeah. So there's more to be explored here. I'm convinced that many, if not most, Sri Lankans are African. And that's another subject for another time.
No, man. No, you're absolutely right. The issue of Black as an African presence in ancient Hindustan is something that we're not paid enough attention to.
Attention to, yeah.
And so
I
one of
hear
these
you.
days,
I hear you.
we should have an
I hear you.
exchange about it. But the
Yeah,
majority of the Indian population, black people, they have long hair, longer hair
yeah,
than us if they're not so-called tribals and fundamentally
yeah,
with hair like ours, African. But that's the base of the Indian population. It's the majority. What happened is that thousands of years ago, some people call themselves Aryans or Euro-Aryans or Indo-Aryans or whatever, invaded India slowly, created a racist ideology, which is what Hinduism is, and imposed that on the Indian population. And opposition to it came from Buddha, who was a black man, Siddhartha Gautama, who organized a philosophically and theologically fantastically rich system called Buddhism.
Yes.
And that's the Indian alternative based on a black man's consciousness, answer to racist Hinduism.
Yes. All right, Ola, so it's getting late. So there's so much I could say on this point here, especially because at the moment, we're at a critical moment.
Asked no question.
No, they didn't. There's only one. I'm gonna come to it in a second. There's only one. So everybody just are listening. Yeah, they're here. They just haven't asked no questions. So if you do have your questions for Ola, so get them in soon. And if please at Kimbunga Media if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Now, get it in quickly. And we'll ask you on the session.
I'm getting old. I'm getting old, so we won't speak. We won't spend more than another 15 minutes. I'm not just getting old. I'm now old. I had my 80th birthday on the 4th.
Yes, indeed. And I forgot to say happy belated birthday, Olasessu's birthday was last week. You know what I mean?
Thank you, my
friend. You give thanks. Yeah. And it was 80. I didn't realize it was such a significant. Yes. It was a significant one.
Big one by all accounts.
Yes, indeed. So you should have had a party on the Sessu. So go on. You shan't change the masses.
No, I didn't want to, and Claire and I are doing something else of equal importance later in the month. So we're gonna just have one thing rather than two.
All right, no problem. Give tax. All right, but yeah, man, give tax for reaching 80. We give tax for life, you know. But I did want to say all this so that there's a growing sensibility among many, including many Africans, to define Caribbean identity as oppositional to African identity. And there are all kinds of permutations to that argument at the moment, and that sensibility, one of which is to assert that we are in fact the indigenous people of the Americas, of the Caribbean, and another is to assert how mixed we are. So within that context, again, that mix allows for the assertion of Indian heritage, and even allows for the assertion of Scottish and Jewish and Irish heritage, but it seems to find a contention with African identity. And so that is a present issue at the moment, in terms of identity and the Caribbean as we develop it, as it stands.
My brother, there's a whole heap of sometimes impressive foolishness on this area of thinking. And,
yes.
Right, so the polyglot idea of the Caribbean, out of many one. Somebody asked, this is not my thought, out of many which one? And what does that one do to the African oneness?
Yes.
And it's absolutely crucial. We're the vast majority everywhere in the Caribbean. And in the places where we're not the majority, like Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname, we got to work together with those people who were there,
of course,
in some kind of power sharing arrangement. But it may or may not be possible. I don't know. But the people, right, and the other problem is that facts get mixed up with myths. So the evidence is that there were Africans in the Caribbean when Columbus got there. It's in the art and artifacts. It's all over the place. It's in the archaeology and the investigation of skeletons and other realities. So we were there, and we were there in significant numbers. So that is true, but it's equally the case, and it's idiotic and anti-historical to displace the majority of people who were there. And the majority of people who were there were a population that came through Asia, down through North America, didn't come out into the Caribbean island directly from North America, but went down into South America, and then came up through the Caribbean from the Lesser Antilles up to the Greater Antilles and then the Bahamas. That's a progression. Not that nobody came in the earliest times across directly from North and Central America, but they populate. That's how the population of the Caribbean happened, and Africans who must have come across the Atlantic were a big part of that population. And no doubt about it. Now, there's a good literature. People like the poet Kamal Brathwaite and somebody who writes on him called Gordon Roulette. These people write incredibly powerfully and interestingly about what it is to be African Caribbean and how rich and creative we have been in a situation where we can come back to this, where everything in the environment told Africans, "Oh no, come from nowhere."
Yes.
And we had to confront that because we knew that we were something. We knew that we had come from somewhere, even if we'd been detached from it. And we're the only ones that have been genuinely creative in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I'm not saying that there are no creative Indian individuals. Like Paul can write, right? and so on. But Caribbean culture is African. It's what our ancestors and us have done in this environment on that journey that began 500 years ago or later, but for these purposes, 500 years ago and so on. And the white people reached back into their European cultural heritage that didn't require them to create anything. And the Indians also reached back into the heritage and practice that they brought with them and didn't require to create anything. We, because of the circumstances and because of our creativity, have created Caribbean culture. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at music or literature, food, whatever. It's all fundamentally African.
Yeah, good point. And I think that's an issue that I'd love to get into more another time, because
happy to explore that sometime with you.
Final thing I want to get into to get into quote unquote the internationalist perspective, as you said, Walter Rodney. And by the way, this book, The Russian Revolution, was actually completed posthumously.
Yes, man, long posthumously. Yeah. He's been dead for almost 40 years when that came out.
When it was completed, So I'm assuming you've completed reading this book. I don't know if you have an assessment of it in terms of the extent to which it reflects.
I'm not sure that we can go into it. It's very fine work, because Walter, especially when he was working at Len, did nothing second rate, right?
Yes.
So that is not a second rate book. It's a close analysis of how the bourgeoisie approached the African Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and how a revolutionary approach to it might be rendered. So that is fundamentally what that book is. My problem with it is that it's the Russian Revolution is the one site of success of the European proletariat. And it's actually been defeated after 70 or so years by its class enemy anyway. And so the fact that Walter was so completely, if critically, a believer in Marxism, with, as I think I was on this program, talking about the failure of Marxist practice. So questions arise for Rodney's work, given what has happened in practice to Marxism.
Which is what I was going to ask you, and I mean we could even, because I know that there is some debate even around whether Russia was actually a proletariat revolution, because they kind of they were coming from feudalism, so similar to China.
The Trotskyists talk rubbish about that.
All right, I'll leave that there for now. But the I was gonna ask you, based upon your in-depth connection to Baba Walter Rodney's work, what would you think, using his analysis? Like let's say a Rodneyist analysis. What do you think his assessment would be of? This is a kind of a big question, so feel free not to be in depth about all of them, but let's say like Russia, China, Cuba. You said he was experts in. What would his assessment or his analysis of these be in the time since his passing up until now?
No, Walter believed in proletarian revolution, right?
Yeah.
And he was not wrong to believe in proletarian revolution. What's wrong with proletarian? There's not that there's anything wrong with it, but that it's failed because because the proletariat didn't manage it in the West, and the Western international forces have reversed it in Russia, and now, not because so much of anti-Marxist politics, but racist politics are aiming to take down China by any means necessary. Having said that, Walter was a believer in proletarian revolution. Critical believer, but actually a believer. And so he welcomed, and he was right to welcome, just as Garvey welcomed the Russian Revolution at length. Garvey. People should read what he said at Liberty Hall in honor of Lenin when Lenin died in whatever year in the 20s. Lenin died.
24.
We need to read what the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey said. So the Russian Revolution, despite the horrible difficulties of their position, the difference between Cuba and Jamaica or Barbados or Trinidad, right? Even if you have oil like Trinidad, it's still desperate in comparison to what the education in other ways the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution has made. And so Rodney had a positive assessment of that, and a positive assessment of the Russian Revolution, and a positive assessment of the Chinese Revolution. It's not that no criticisms are possible where those three processes are concerned. Of course, criticism is possible. If you're Jamesian or Trotskyite, you have what looks like a persuasive critique of them, but their achievement for their people and for the world's people are important. That the Russian Revolution, the Great October Revolution, is now history, and that Cuba is menaced and that they're coming for China means something.
All right, Elder Cecil. So yeah, another day, because I'm very interested to get into the Russian Revolution. Is something that I've been studying, and the Chinese Revolution as well. So I'm very interested to get into to Rodney's perspective on this. So and at another point we'll have some more conversation.
We can have a point about that. Next time maybe we ought to look at Caribbean and diaspora culture, and then
absolutely.
that's beautiful. to Walter and these matters.
That's beautiful.
So that we have a
question from the chat. Baba Cecil, do you think Nkrumah and Rodney were more uniting Africans than socialism? So I guess that's supposed to be like more about uniting Africans than socialism, or more focused on uniting Africans than socialism. And I guess that you said that there's not a conflict there.
No, I think that both of them would have taken seriously and did take seriously the requirement, and it's probably a historical requirement, to unite Africa on the basis of something like socialism. Now, nationalists are fond of saying that Marx stole socialism from Africans and
to be fair, I first heard that from Nkrumahist, not nationalists, but yeah.
and Nkrumahs are Pan-Africanists, Africanists. Not true.
Yes.
Right? So even if I say, and I do, that both Rodney and Nkrumah believe that the route to African unity and self-liberation, and a big part of that route was socialism. And I undermentioned the claim that socialism stole socialism from Africa in order to remind those who might be listening that what Rodney and Nkrumah might have been reaching for wasn't entirely what came originally out of the mouths and books and pages of Marx and Engels, but were reaching back to a form of social organization that was non-exploitative, that didn't have exploiting classes in charge, that understood cooperation and cooperatives and so on and so forth, as Garvey tried to build.
Yes, brothers, this is another subject for another time, and we'll definitely get into Garveyism as cooperative economic development as well. We're doing work on those things, so we want to raise the political economic education of our community. Elder Cecil, as always, you have been insightful and enlightening, and so we hope that we trust that ones have learned something today, especially on the life and legacy of Baba Walter Rodney. I did mean to clarify that the name of the essay on West Africa that Baba Walter Rodney wrote is called A History of the Upper Guinea Coast. A history of the Upper Guinea Coast.
Yes, that's right.
It's quite detailed, but essential, especially in this time where the forces of global white supremacy, white power, imperialism are doing mischief with the history of enslavement, so as to legitimize their power in today's world. That history is extremely important, and one that doesn't try to wash over the difficult questions as far as complicity is concerned. But a very important history nonetheless. So do check that out, brothers and sisters.
And he also does have, Walter, that is, a really neat little paper called West Africa and the Atlantic Slave Trade. It's only about 24 pages long, but well worth a quick read. Yes.
Give thanks for that, Elder Cecil. So do get into Walter Rodney. You will be enriched as a result. You know what I'm saying? There's a reason why, especially How You're Underdeveloped Africa is still a classic and relevant book for many brothers and sisters. So do check that out. All right. Okay, Elder Cecil, I'm gonna let you go. Give thanks once again. You know what I'm saying? So enjoy the rest of your night, evening, and we look forward to receiving you again.
Great to have been with you, my brother, and I look forward to another evening sometime soon.
As always. Take care. I love to auntie as well.
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah, man.
Blessings. All right, family. That was Elder Cecil Gutsmore. Breaking it down. So effectively, what you got today was an exploration of the work and relevance of Baba Walter Rodney. And I can tell you that there are two scholars that our elder holds in significantly high regard. Walter Rodney is one of them, and Baba Tony Martin is another. Yeah, Baba Tony Martin, foremost scholar on the life and legacy of Papa Garvey and the UNIA ACL. And so I'm sure another day we'll get a similar exploration of the work and relevance of Baba Tony Martin, yeah, from Elder Cecil Gutsmore. I want to just repeat, just let brothers and sisters know and be aware of the fact that I have had the pleasure of collaborating with other brothers and sisters and elders, most notably Mama Marimba Ani, in the publishing of the African World Special Edition, the War Report, brothers and sisters. And this is a 70-page publication that is packed with information about the current fight against neocolonialism on the African continent and in the Caribbean, yeah, inspired by many of the uprisings that have been, and protests and political shifts that have been taking place in the African diaspora. And so some of the things that we engage in here is a listing of the places in which the US government has a military base, yeah, on the African continent, and things of that nature, brothers and sisters. You don't, like, you need, yeah, to get in on the information here. We have done some shows on the alliance of the Sahel states and Senegal and so on and so forth, and do stay tuned, because there are updates in our analysis that needs to take place. Yeah, so we're organizing those shows at the moment, as Elder Cecil rightly said. Whereas there was a lot of optimism about the election in Senegal, yeah, recently, some of the promise of that particular election doesn't look like it's going to bear fruit, yeah, as it stands, given the current trajectory of the government as it stands at the moment. And so we are amassing, we had our brother Sekou, who did our initial breakdown of that situation, and he's going to come back soon to do an update, yeah, and an analysis of what is taking place in Senegal. So do stay tuned in relation to that. But let me just let you know about some of what is in the publication, so that you can feast your eyes. And it's absolutely free, yeah, it's absolutely free, and you can download it right now by clicking the link in the description to the video. All right, so check it out right now, absolutely free. And so I have a piece in here on economic warfare, the IMF, World Bank, and white propaganda. Our brother Ola Eshu has a piece on the ghost of Cecil Rhodes, the Anglo-American conspiracy. I'm just going through Disturbing Truths, Kenyan Mercenaries in IET by brother Jafrik IET. Yeah. Background to the World Within Kenya, yeah, by brother Achola Otieno, who is featured here. Also, Baba Jerry Johnson in Ghana has a article on Africa, Ghana, debt, and the IMF. Mama Marimba has an article on modern colonies, poisonous aid. Yeah. There's an article in here on life and debt, the IMF in Jamaica. Occupied territory, yeah, and that lists military bases, yeah, on the African continent. All right, so that's a very, because a lot of us don't pay attention to these things, yeah, and what a military base means, and then there's also an article on Nigeria, on political organization, yeah, and that's by Shehan Kuti in relation to what is happening currently in Nigeria, yeah. And then there's a piece on resources for study, yeah, resources for study, which gives you some resources that you can go ahead and do further research. And we end with a piece by Mama Marimba Ani on war as context, yeah, an editorial comment by Mama Marimba Ani. Trust me, you want to download this, and you can get it right now by clicking the link in the description. It's absolutely free, brothers and sisters, absolutely 100% free for you to acquire right now, yeah, for you to acquire right this minute now. I also want to let you know that the return of Kushkim University is coming at the end of the month. And for those who are part of our Patreon family, link is in the description as well. Patreon family, link in the description. You will be able to access this next week. Yeah. So if you're part of the Patreon, you'll be able to watch the return of Kushkim University next week, and Brother Robin Walker's presentation and breakdown on the ancient empire of Ghana, brothers and sisters. Yeah, so do stay tuned. Got a couple of events coming up as well, brothers and sisters. So do stay tuned for more information. We are also affiliates of the Black Secret, and so if you look in the description, you'll find you can join the Black Secret #1 online Black Studies course in the world right here now. And yeah, do come through to the Black Secret as well. We are proud partners and affiliates of the Black Secret here at Kimbunga Media. And with that, brothers and sisters, I say unto thee, Tendai Mwali, be thankful unto the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe. Kodzai Mudzimo Mokolo, we give praises unto our great ancestors. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodie, African power and African liberation for all African people. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe.
And so one of the things that, we must push, all of us, is this fundamental question of the global nature of our African identities. That we stop, to see ourselves as Nigerians and Gabonese and, Ghanaians and Congolese and all these other nonsensical identities that we have. But not just that we talk about them like we're talking now, but that it's actually, embedded in our spirits, in our psyche, and in our approach to our work. Because those of you, who are on the continent know that we face, this crisis of religion, this crisis of ethnicism that is tearing us apart. And the only solution to that is going to, to start to address things and see things as a global body. And that when we speak of a Federation of African States, we're not just referring to us on the continent, but that we are coming to the table with all of our power. And our power means the millions of Africans in the diaspora. That there's that clarity of understanding. So it's not something we just talk about or we preach about, but that we actually begin to implement.
Black people, we've got to fight. Jean Petro, you see us. Oguo, we've got to fight. Let's go fight. Oh, Black people, we've got to fight. Zumbi, you see us. Oh, we've got to fight. Let's go fight. Oh, Black people, we've got to fight. Yes, Santa, why you see us? Oh, we've got to fight. Let's go fight. Oh, Black people, we've got to fight. Bookman, you see us. Oh, we've got to fight. Let's go fight. Oh,
We have to have the courage to construct our own reality. And that's what Garvey was talking about. Because he said he looked around, he didn't see what he thought should be there, and so what did he do? He didn't get depressed about it. He didn't get defeated about it. He said, I'm gonna build the government that we need to have. Ooh. Where do you get that kind of boldness from? So we gotta go all the way back to Garvey, who said he would come again. He said he would be here with us, no matter how long it took. And I'm telling you that the way he comes back is in our work. Not honoring him in words, pomp and all of that stuff, but honoring him through doing what he did. How many of us have the courage to do that? The man took on the world for us and in our name. And then we come to Sodai. And in this presentation of the paradigm, I'm going to make this like what it is we want to reach. So Sodai is translated clear word in Dogana language. And I use it to mean that here we gain understanding. This is sight with understanding. And it is seeing beyond what just we think we see with this physical thing. It's seeing beyond that. And so we gain vision, because that's what vision is. With vision, you've got to be able to use the imagination informed by the African spirit. And Brother Amos, who I work very closely with, was a good friend of mine. He taught me, and he would talk about imagination. Image a nation. Do you see? But that's got to be part of vision. To be a visionary, you got to see beyond this box here. You got to see beyond the Ma'afa. You got to see what is it that our people rightfully should have, and that's what Garvey did. Garvey had a vision.